This meeting is being recorded.
This meeting is being recorded. So welcome to this meeting, hybrid meeting. We're going to try and make it a success. From the past 6 or 8 months of experience, it can go 2 ways. We can fail miserably, or we can succeed. I'm not sure where the bets should be placed, but we'll do our best. And so we have, let's see, we have about 10-15 people here in the room, and we have, I can't see how many people, about 20 people online now, and I think there are a few more who were registered, so hopefully getting in there. So in terms of, I'm just going to say a couple of words to introduce Tanya, and she'll take us through kind of the main objective of the workshop. So this came together, the workshop came together because Tanya Wyatt, Dr. Tanya Wyatt has got in touch, and she's been doing an incredibly interesting research and wanted to find an avenue to share it and have a discussion and take some of the findings of the research that are on the cross-section between what is wildlife trade, how it's regulated, and how that relates to plants trade, plants being part of wildlife, of course. And so we build on that. We put together a few more presentations, and most importantly, and that's a big part of the agenda for the meeting, we've got breakout groups and discussions, and we're going to try, and again, in a good spirit of a hybrid meeting, we'll try to make it all work across both worlds. So we'll have a group here, and then we'll have a few groups online as well, so that all of you participating online can contribute. So without further ado, I'm gonna,
No, that's not right. Thank you, Audrey. That was amazing, clicking through so many screens that are open out here, so thank you. So yes, I'm Tanya Wyatt. I'm a professor of criminology at Northumbria University in Newcastle. And I had 2 years of funding by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which might sound a strange place to be doing wildlife trade research. But it's where law and legal studies actually sits as a discipline in the UK. And through that 2 years, I did a really deep dive into the legislative content of CITES, which I'll talk a bit about. And as a part of that project, my colleague, Alison Hutchinson, who's here in the room back there, we really tried to explore in more depth what is wildlife? How is wildlife actually defined in legislation? Because it came up over and over again in the interviews I did, that this might be a hurdle as to why some species are being protected and why others aren't being protected. And so Alison and I, along with actually Kim Friedman at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, we did a deep dive on fish, which is a separate article. But now Alison and I are really focused in on plants and wondering how they actually feature in the legislation. So the original funding I have, I mentioned I did this content analysis. And I'm happy to share this all with you. This is actually all on my website as well, this enormous year-long spreadsheet where I tried to find all of the wildlife legislation. And Alison has recently actually updated that for another project. So we're happy to share that. That obviously has some limitations because of language. Sometimes the legislation gets updated in the middle of all of this. So the content analysis was of 179 of the 183 at the time that I was doing it. And it was Arabic as a language that Google Translate hasn't got to yet, but will probably be there soon. I then did a Delphi iterative survey, and this is just a proper name of a survey where you develop a lot of in-depth questions, and you send them out to a panel of experts. They comment, you reformulate the questions and share the answers of those experts anonymously and send it back out. So I had 32 participants in the first round and 23 participants in the second round, which is very small. And I should say, I sent this to well over 700 people because I used the management and scientific authorities of all of the CITES authorities around the world and sent it to them. So there was very little take up, on the survey. I then did 20 semi-structured interviews about best practice. And from that survey, 3 countries popped out and were mentioned as having really lessons to be learned or best practice, and that was Canada, South Africa, and Indonesia. And so those 20 semi-structured interviews really focused on what we learned about from those 3 countries in particular. And that is all featured in the book that came out last year, is CITES Protecting Wildlife, and I'd be happy to share that book with you all if you're interested. So now I have this follow-on funding, which is about sharing what I found, but also expanding on that. So there's 4 knowledge exchange workshops. There's the one that I held in Vienna when I was at UNODC for 2 months. So January and February of this year, we had a joint workshop, a discussion on tackling illicit wildlife trafficking through the additional protocol to the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. So that was in collaboration with the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. They both helped me arrange that, and we had 20 delegates from the UN actually attend that, and it seems to be paying off a bit because they were messaging me yesterday. The meeting for this convention is actually taking place in Vienna right now, and Ecuador has come on board as supporting this additional protocol. So there's 7 countries now that are backing this as a way forward for actually trying to better tackle wildlife crime. Wildlife and the Law, Implications and Way Forward was the second knowledge exchange workshop. It was very similar to this one, but we talked just about animals. So Mezeb and I were in Portland, Oregon at the Lewis and Clark Law School. So you guys might know they have the only LLM in animal law in the world. So they have a lot of amazing students there that are doing masters around wildlife trade and wildlife law. So that was a great venue, great event. And then here we are, Plants and Law, and then there's one more event next week in collaboration with the Wildlife Conservation Society, looking at pandemics and what's happened 2 years on. So this event here is then funded through that AHRC follow-on funding. So we can thank the UK taxpayers for vegan cake today. Sorry, online people, you'll miss out on that. So what about plants and wildlife? And I'm sure I'm not saying anything new to the audience here listening, that what does that look like in terms of CITES legislation? And these are the amazing artistic skills of Allison, who has put this together around the breakdown of Appendix 1, Appendix 2, Appendix 3. But then also, if you can see, that outer rim is what the overlap is with the IUCN at risk. So those top 3 categories, right, of critically endangered or threatened, and then not at risk, or that there is no IUCN record. And you could see for so much of it, nearly all of the orchids that make up nearly all of that 32,000 in the middle there, there isn't much IUCN overlap with what we know for CITES. And then plants are the 414 over in Appendix 1, and then very few in Appendix 3. But I do think it's interesting that where we have animals broken down by class, we just have plants in one big blob. There's no distinguishing what species these are. They're just, plants are all grouped in together, even though there's a tremendous amount of diversity in species, we all know. And interesting, this overlap between, or not overlap between, what the IUCN is finding, or sorry, actually collecting data about, and what CITES is protecting or not protecting. And this is just the article, which again, I'd be happy to share, that Allison's the lead author on in the journal that we published last year. So just to break down what is in all that CITES plants, and we know that it is mostly orchids. Yeah, you can see most of it, but you can see that orchids are the largest of it, but also that we have other species in there. So cacti are in particular featured quite heavily. We have the cycads. An interesting one that came up in other research I've done is around Euphorbia. So several years ago, I had a project with Inés Arroyo Quiros in Mexico, looking at what's happening between Mexico and the European Union. And in addition to succulents and particularly cacti coming out of Mexico, if you look at the seizures between Mexico and parts of Europe, Euphorbia came up a lot. And Euphorbia, you all probably know this better than I do. This is the Euphorbia antisyphilitica species, which has so many uses. It's actually quite prevalent because the wax is used for industrial lubricants, but also in cosmetics and more in sort of everyday products. Could be in food as a preservative as well. So it's really versatile. And as an interesting side note that Inez and I have talked about, we need to go back and actually research, is that the interaction for Euphorbia between sustainable or possibly unsustainable trade and human rights and human labor. So apparently Euphorbia is incredibly harmful to people to actually be extracting the wax out of. It's a really chemically toxic environment for people to be working in. They're using sulfuric acid to strip the plant parts from the wax. So the people that are working in this industry are suffering a lot of health conditions and longer chronic diseases. So as we see in lots of different wildlife trade, there's these intersections of human rights abuses and labor issues as well. So diving into those definitions of wildlife. So of the 179 that we managed to actually look at, when they actually give a definition of wildlife, here is the way that we coded that. So first of all, 81 pieces of legislation don't provide a definition of wildlife. They just take it for granted that people who are reading it, or judges or regulators, are going to understand what wildlife is. And there's no further description. The word is just used rather, uncritically. The separate code that you see there on next to the right is where there's a clear indication that there is another piece of legislation apart from wildlife law that's going to deal with some plants in some form. And typically this is forestry legislation, where they would be a direct reference to timber being dealt with in forestry legislation, that timber are not categorized as wildlife. The timber example I'll go into in more detail in just a second. There's some implied included where maybe flora or plants and timber are maybe mentioned, or they're probably mentioned, but we couldn't quite tell. Partially included, which I'll give an example of, this usually has to do with native versus non-native, or maybe plants but not trees, as being, so some plants are included but not all plants. 71, they're clearly listed in a definition of wildlife, and in 10, they are specifically excluded, where it says, here is wildlife, and there's no mention of plants at all. So the examples, I think Qatar has an interesting, very clear definition. So animal kingdom, when we've got all the animals in there, maybe they're missing insects though, now that I look more closely. But then there's the addition to bacteria, fungus, plants, indigenous or exotic, which I think is somewhat pretty comprehensive. In contrast, you have the Russian legislation, so the federal law on wildlife, only mentions wild animals and animal origin for genetic materials. There's no mention of flora or plants in there. Maybe there's a separate forestry plant legislation, but it isn't included. They aren't included in wildlife. And then Mongolia, the term plants shall include natural and planted forests, trees, types of higher and lower plants, which is, I'm not sure if that's a scientific, it might be, but higher and lower is an interesting kind of breakdown there. And then we have Sierra Leone, which is an interesting one because it's around policy. It's a conservation policy, not a law. And that policy is very clear that the 1972 Act is rather poor and needs to be updated. So this policy is sort of taking being a bit of a stopgap, but it does show that wildlife refers to all species of indigenous terrestrial and aquatic flora and fauna. And this is what I was referring to earlier about native versus non-native. So technically, it's only indigenous to Sierra Leone, so wildlife outside of the country is not categorized within this, or not protected within that legislation. And I mentioned there's one piece of legislation that particularly defines timber in addition to defining plants. And this is the Nature Conservation Act of Bhutan. And maybe there's something lost in translation. I kind of think that the language is quite interesting, that it gets translated as forest produce. So what's coming out of the forest is a resource, or a product, which is interesting. But there's clear classification of trees and everything from them. So firewood, charcoal, bark, resin, latex, all of that as being protected. And then plants are also separated out in all of their parts. Fungi also being included in plants, and alive or dead. And then wild animals, specifically mentioning that fish are included in all of the different parts. And then a forest produce is also boulders, stones, sand. So the inorganic or inanimate elements are protected as well, which is really comprehensive and interesting, I think. So what Alice and I are working on and writing about is this, first of all, the plant blindness, which we're going to hear more about later, where plants are just ignored by legislation or not directly protected, and what are the consequences of that? What does it mean if plants aren't actually listed in legislation? Are these loopholes for exploitation? And then the speciesism, that we treat some plants in some ways and other plants in other ways. And in particular, we see this big divide between trees, which are incredibly economically valuable, obviously, a massive industry, maybe one of the biggest industries, profit makers in the world, being treated differently to other kinds of plant species. And obviously, CITES does this speciesism, we would argue quite clearly, with flowering plants, where orchids are, the vast majority of CITES plants that are listed, of all species that are actually listed in CITES. So there's parts to unpack about our different aesthetic value or economic value around plants, and how this actually is then reflected in legislation and thus in conservation and protection. And just to sort of set the tone for the day or the afternoon, what hopefully we can chat about more in the later sessions in the breakout groups is, what are the solutions to this? How can legislation be better at including everything? And from my CITES research, I think personally that the National Legislation Project is one way that we should be improving CITES. So the National Legislation Project is part of CITES that goes in and basically judges whether a party's legislation matches CITES legislation or not. So the convention requires that parties do 4 things in particular. And if you do all 4 things as a country, then you get listed as a category 1. And there's only 50% after 50 years of CITES that have actually fully implemented the way that the convention was meant to be. And these 4 things are pretty minor and light touch. So do you have a scientific and a management authority? Is trade prohibited in violation of the convention? Are there penalties? And is there scope for confiscation? So those are the only 4 measures that CITES is judging itself by. And as I said, only half of countries after 50 years are actually, almost 50 years, are managing to do that. So I think there's scope to really improve the national legislation project. I've referred to it as earth jurisprudence, but we could also think of legislation that we see particularly coming out of Latin America around rights of nature, constitutions that recognize more than just humans as being needed to be covered in legislation. So we've seen some cases out of Ecuador and Bolivia where individual animals are given rights. We see this for rivers and other contexts, and I think we're going to see this for plants. And there's probably examples out there that I don't know of, but the idea that we really need to reconfigure how we do our legislation to be more inclusive of all the other species. And then what about sustainability? Are we approaching that the right way? How does that fit in with other tensions around protection and use? And so I think there's a lot more discussion to be had around how we can approach sustainable trade and what sustainable trade looks like in different contexts for different people, and how we can get more voices involved in that conversation, I think is really critical to that. So I am going to leave it there. And that's just the opener kind of big picture of where we're at with plants in regards to wildlife. I believe now, Nastia, is it you and Sarah giving us the nitty-gritty and the more detail of all these different trades that plants are featured in.
Thanks, Tanya. And if you have questions, the way we set out the agenda, we have 2 presentations and a little spot for discussion, and then 2 presentations and a spot for discussion, and then we'll all speak together. So if you have questions to Tanya, also please use the chat and do drop questions in there because we can keep an eye on that and then bring them up. Just give us a second. It's okay.
Sorry, did I do something wrong?
No. I think it's the way that the computer is set up. Do you have notes for this?
No.
Oh, okay, then no worries.
And this presentation isn't just me, and Sarah isn't here right this minute, but she's going to aboard. And I'm doing this presentation with kind of 2 hats on. So my name is Anastasia Timoshina, and I'm working in traffic. I'm a senior program coordinator on sustainable trade. I'm also on the IUCN Species Survival Commission Plant Conservation Committee, and we are, as well as a few other kind of IUCN hats with particular plant specialist groups. And one of the main intentions or my role in the Plant Conservation Committee is how we can advance generally the issues of use and trade of plants in the broader conservation agenda, which quite often focuses on thinking about threats to plants, but how can we bring in the use and trade angle? So this presentation, and I'll invite Sarah to introduce herself in a minute, this presentation we thought would neatly follow from what Tanya is talking about, and really we're trying to frame the issue of why does it even matter? So does it matter that these species are protected or not? How big is this trade? What do we know or don't know about it? So I'm going to kick off by saying that well, roughly we can, when we talk about the trade in plants, it's not homogeneous. So there are whole different types of commodities that are in trade. So of course there is trade in timber, and we know about it very well from furniture and building of houses and so on. There is a rapidly a massive trade for horticultural or ornamental purposes, for species ranging from orchids to succulent plants. And, we do see these headlines in the media about poaching crisis in, say, Southern Africa or US. And also there is some of the more, I guess, hidden and obscure trade in plants because they're actually used in a slightly less recognizable form. So plants that are traded as ingredients in food or cosmetic or medicines. So if we think about, the complexity of trade, we talk about from something that's traded in really large volumes and is quite visible, but difficult to recognize because it's maybe wood or wood product, through to live plants, through to ingredients. But also this trade, similar as with other types of wildlife trade, this is just a mock-up example of an unspecified non-timber forest product, plant and trade. Quite often you have this parallel value chains, so trade chains that are running concurrently, and that makes the regulation and understanding of trade really complex because there is an interaction between the local users and how the trade chains or value chains work within that, all the way through to the international level trade, where again, species or ingredients could be passing quite a large number of stakeholders. And so if we're thinking about kind of trade in plant resources, so plants are the world's largest, most significantly traded wildlife commodity. Full stop. So that's my attempt to lean back into that presentation and explain why we think it's important to discuss this. Because if it's not regulated, if it's not covered by regulations at the national level, that is problematic. And of course, it makes it an extremely important source of both revenue for communities as well as for nations. So trade in timber resources is probably one of the biggest contributors to the economic flows within the country. The estimates, however, are that between 10 to 30% of timber trade is globally illegal and higher in some other places. And that does contribute to dangerous levels of deforestation, loss of species, loss of revenue. There is a large volume of trade in ornamental or horticultural species, and some of it is in wild collected botanicals. A lot of it, of course, is propagated. So it's very likely that if you're buying, an orchid in DIY shop, it's propagated. And then there are thousands of species in trade in the form of ingredients. And again, most of it is probably sustainable and probably legal, but because they have this feature of not being visible in the supply chains, they go through the very complex trade chains, we don't really know. And so the traceability and sustainability of those supply chains is really difficult to understand. And then if you think about the complexity of illicit trade, and I use the word illicit here to differentiate from illegal, and really to imply that we're talking about both the illegal in relation to the legislation or existing policies, but also to kind of ethical norms and potentially social norms. There is a whole range of reasons that are driving this trade, and it's anything from kind of unsustainable, responsible demand and consumption practices through to inadequate legislation, lacking enforcement, corruption, and weak governance that creates sort of conditions for this to exist, and just simple invisibility of species in trade, which prevents them from being understood properly and action taken. So I have a couple of diagrams here, and I'm not going to go through the details. It's more about just a picture, which is worth 1,000 words. So this is from my colleague Chan-Hin Kyung, who is on the call with us and is a specialist in traffic on timber trade. So this is an illustration of a simplified timber trade chain, and I think one thing to draw attention to is simplified. So a number of steps that it takes or it may take for a timber species from the harvesting or logging point to take until the point of consumption, where it's used, where it's produced into final product. But also in orange are these different points at which illegality may occur. So when we talk about the illegal products in trade, we don't just speak about something that happens at the harvesting level, at the logging level, but also there could be a mixing of illegally logged forests and wood into any of the supply chains, any of the points in the supply chain. Then I've got another one, and this is a very different resource, or an example of resource, and a mock-up or of a real supply chain of something that's actually fairly probably low risk from the perspective of ecological sustainability. So dandelion root, which is a very popular herbal medicine that's used in teas and medicines. And this is a simple kind of supply chain from pollen to where it's harvested through to the final producer and retail in the US. But it does suggest, again, the multiple steps that it takes for that product. And this is a fairly straightforward, simple supply chain where the products are processed at different points. They go through at least 2 or 3 countries. They change hands a number of times. And I think the idea here that I want to draw attention to is how complex it is to think about traceability and to think about kind of tracking and linking to the adequate regulation of trade, and the challenge kind of we have at hand with this. And this is another, to overwhelm everyone, I have another diagram. And actually what I wanted to draw attention to here is something about kind of a wider environment in which trade exists. So again, this is a simplified sort of value chain or supply chain, let's say, of tropical timber from a producer level through to consumer. But what I'm kind of interested about here is these 2 columns on the right-hand side, and how we can think about a range of enabling or infrastructure industries and stakeholders that are involved in trade. So we need to think about transport sector, we need to think about finances and banking sector that actually may unwittingly be supporting illicit practices. We need to also be thinking about this whole range of external influences or kind of contextual enabling environment factors that may have to do with political issues and bringing governance and corruption and so on. So when we think about why it matters, or how we think about the impact of use and trade on species. This is, the IPBES Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services is a handy kind of global cut on general drivers of biodiversity loss on all species. I think what I want to first kind of quickly draw attention to is the impact of, or estimated impact of, direct exploitation, so the direct use of the resources on various kind of terrestrial, freshwater, marine ecosystems. And so direct exploitation is first or second driver of biodiversity loss for this species. And this is significant because it is, these are estimates, of course, and approximations, but it is put next to the climate change impact as well. And I think for us, again, is justifying why thinking about the sustainability of the offtake of species, of the of trade that may be driving that offtake potentially unsustainable is really important. So what do we know about the plants? And I'm going to start from plant ingredients that are used for medicinal plants, and then I'll pass it on to Sarah to talk us about some of the biggest commodities in trade. So in terms of the species that are used for medicinal and aromatic purposes, and you may think about them as ingredients used in cosmetic, food, wellness products, there are about 26,000 species that are have a well-documented use, and what it means is that species that would be listed in traditional medicine systems or pharmacopoeias of particular countries. So the big issue in terms of that conservation status and impact on them is that we know very little. We know the assessment, so there is an IUCN Red List assessment for those completed for only 19% of species. And out of those, 10% are threatened with extinction in the wild. So they're in those 3 categories that Tanya was talking about. Is it problematic for this species? Well, we think it is. However, you could also think about it is the species that have been probably underpinning, healthcare and medicinal needs of people for a very, very long time. They have a history and tradition of use. So you could also consider whether there is a particular bias because there hasn't been a comprehensive assessment done. Is there a particular bias here with the assessment because more threatened species being assessed? However, the thing that makes kind of us concerned, and this is where the consideration of the rates of use and trade need to be considered, is just the increase in the use of the species. And these figures here, so it suggests that over the past 20 years, there have been a 75% increase in value of trade and 22% increase in volume of trade. This is quite big, and this is actually really probably a gross understatement of an actual picture, because for a lot of these species, trade statistics are not collected, they're not listed, they're not included in trade statistics, so it really goes under the radar. And actually that takes us back to that issue of regulation. If these species aren't really going through the national statistics, countries don't get revenues from that trade, it does create a situation in which they're not known and we don't know about the impacts of that trade. And then just recognize the what it means. So what is meant to say is that even in the last 2 years, we think there has been quite a significant increase in interest and the use of plants as treatments or just general wellness products, treatment for COVID, and we've been kind of documenting this a little bit. But this basically is trying to paint a picture in which we know that the trend is that this is increasing. There is a lot of interest in natural products. So what does it mean for plants and what does it mean for their production?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nastia. I'm Sarah Oldfield and I'm co-chair of the IUCN SSC Global Tree Specialist Group. And we have been working with Botanic Gardens Conservation International on a global tree assessment. The aim of the global tree assessment is to assess the conservation status of all the world's trees. And we put together a global list of tree species, and we reckon that there are around about 58,000 tree species. And we have been red listing them all, and that's the aim. So we know that approximately 30% of all tree species are threatened with extinction, and that there are around 13,000 tree species listed as threatened on the IUCN Red List, and then the remaining chunk are species which have been assessed by regional or national assessments with equivalent to IUCN Global status, and those species are all recorded in BGCI's threat search database. A further 13% of tree species have been evaluated as data deficient, so they could be threatened, they might not be, we need more information. I think what is really interesting, so it will be possible, Tanya, to match up the threat status of tree species with what's listed on CITES. What we don't really know enough about by any means yet is the impact of trade directly on the threatened status of tree species. So in 2014, a list was put together of internationally traded commercial timber species, and around about 1,500 tree species in international trade recorded by the name. But this is definitely an underestimate. And of course, then there are also many other tree species that are traded nationally or regionally, but very often the trade in timber isn't documented to species level. So when we look at the impact of logging and harvesting for timber on tree species, echoing what Nastia said, that overexploitation is a major driver of species loss, it certainly is for tree species. Logging is the second, logging and wood harvesting as the second most commonly recorded threat to tree species as recorded on the IUCN Red List. And that logging may be, and wood harvesting might be having a direct impact on the species, or it might just be more indirect through clear felling, and non-target species are threatened in the process. So logging, wood harvesting recorded for 27% of tree species on the IUCN Red List, and not surprisingly, agriculture is the largest driver of threat. So over 4,000 species on the IUCN Red List have construction and structural as their use recorded. They don't record timber as such, of which 1,400 and around 1,400 are recorded as threatened. So at least 1,400 timber species are threatened with extinction. And as we understand more about what the drivers of threat are, then that figure would change. A red list of timber species is currently in press. Megan Barstow, one of the authors, is with us online in this meeting, together with Ryan Hills and other collaborators. So overall, we still know far too little about the impact of levels of harvesting and trade on individual tree species. The value of the global timber trade is enormous, as Tanya's already mentioned. It's more than doubled over the past 20 years, reaching 153 billion in 2018. It's difficult to get really good figures on the trade, and you look at different sources and they all seem to say slightly different things, and it partly depends what's timber, what's not timber. And wood pulp is a further major item in international trade. Timber consumption is continuing to rise and is forecast to triple over the next 30 years. Driven by factors such as increasing urbanization and, ironically, greening of the economy, so more use of timber as a sustainable resource in building and so on. So that's timber consumption is certainly growing, and I think we do need to try and get a handle on what the impact that is having on individual species, if we can. Approximately 300 million cubic meters of tropical hardwood is harvested annually, and I took that from the very good traffic report that came out several years ago. That's equivalent to an estimated 100 million trees. I mean, the figures are meaningless in a way, but it's a lot of trees are being chopped down. What we also know, which relates to the complexity of controlling and legislating for the timber, is that it's hugely complex, it's highly varied, and much of it is illegal, as we've heard several times already today. And the majority of timber is wild sourced. There is obviously plantation grown timber, but the majority of the timber, particularly coming from tropical regions, is still directly taken from the wild. Sorry, I don't think it's the arrows. Oh, there we go. Just wanted to mention the speciality tropical hardwoods. And there's so many, as we say, there's so many different kinds of species in trade, but the speciality tropical hardwoods, which are effectively mined, ruthlessly exploited without really any effective management. And there may be legislation, but it really isn't working. And obviously the classic example is Dalbergia, the rosewoods, a tropical genus of trees. There are over 20 Dalbergia species that grow as trees rather than lianas or shrubs in Central America. 18 of those species are assessed as critically endangered, endangered or vulnerable, 1 as near threatened and 1 as data deficient. And there really are, every tree stump is being dug out of the wild for some of the most valuable species. So that there's absolutely no effective management. The main threat is clearly for hard timber, for both local and international demand, particularly from the Far East, from China as a source of rosewood for Hmong furniture. And of course, the situation in Madagascar became critical around 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And there are 48 tree species of Dalbergia in Madagascar, of which 40 are listed as threatened, near threatened, or data deficient on the IUCN red list. And there's a red list of all Madagascan trees which records that information. And one of the problems with that specialty timber trade is that the trade shifts. And so African species of Robertia, often known as Babinga, which also produce a rosewood timber, they have become more and more increasingly marketed over the past 40, 50 years or so because of the decline in the Dalbergia species and the global demand for rosewoods, scarcity of the Dalbergia species, increasingly more recently attempts to regulate the trade have driven the trade to look for alternatives, and Robertia is one of the groups. So we almost need to be able to anticipate trends and fashions in the trade so we can be one step ahead rather than being reactive. But that's obviously a big task. Why am I not talking very well? Oh, there we go. I also wanted to mention another group of trees. Obviously, so the Dalbergia are the sort of very speciality timber with precise end uses. The Tetracarps are a more general purpose type of timber producing trees. And on Borneo, so they're predominantly Southeast Asian, and they're the dominant trees of the tropical forest of Southeast Asia. And in Borneo alone, over 3.5 billion worth of Tetracarp timber is exported every year from the island. Out of the 162 endemic Tetracarps to Borneo, 99 are threatened with extinction. So obviously all the impact of this trade is both felt at, the species are being threatened with extinction, loss of livelihoods, loss of economics at a national scale, loss of income at a national scale, but also the impact on forest ecosystems and ecosystem services is huge. When you are taking out so many of the sort of dominant species in the forest, then clearly that is going to have a major ecological impact. And really all trade in plant species, extraction of plants from their ecosystems does have an impact at an ecological level, and certainly has an impact on the people who are part of the ecosystems. And I'm now going to hand over to Nasta. But I also did want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be involved today, because I'm really quite excited about this.
Just 2 slides to finish this, and so we can take it to discussion. So what can we do about it? And here are some ideas, how we could think about the approaches, and also where does that regulation of trade fit in? So having strong laws that work and also enable good practices is extremely important. And I think we're seeing it a lot. Well, we're seeing a lot more development driven at both national and international level for timber trade. Importing countries attempted to create conditions and frameworks in which only legally traded wood is entering in the country, for instance. And it's a very powerful mechanism of how trade could be encouraged to be legal and maybe sustainable. Improved business practices. So how do we actually affect the work of industry? Again, I'm leaning heavily on some of the examples of colleagues in the room who work, for example, with associations in China that are sourcing tropical timber from Congo Basin. There is a massive opportunity in that drive to create conditions and demand for more legal and sustainable goods. How does that interplay with regulations? Well, sometimes in a very, very powerful way, because clearly businesses do respond to good regulations that actually purposefully designed and actually have a system of incentives and consumption practices. Again, we speak a lot about what do consumers know about the trade. If they knew it was threatened, would it matter? There is a lot of science behind how do you craft and create the behavioral change approaches, and it's multilateral interventions. I think that's really a nod towards mechanisms such as CITES or regional agreements that could all actually be encouraging positive practices in supply chains and pushing countries to be more collaborative around something. And so just to finish this bit of presentation with 11 points, 11 is a good number, quite long number, long list. So what are some things that work and where we need maybe more emphasis around the issues of trade and regulating and ensuring legal sustainable trade in plant resources? Well, I hope that this presentation encouraged you to think or see how evaluating and further evidencing kind of risks and opportunities associated with trade is really important. We need good data because that underpins good action. It gives us, scientific basis to why particular actions should be taken, and that links, a bit to points 2 and 3, really, further greater understanding of the impact on individual tree species. But also that point that Sarah made about kind of understanding how the market and demand changes. Can we predict what will be the next species that will be needed or used? And if we were able to do some sort of early warning system, how would it work, and would we be able to intervene and respond to it, including through maybe good regulations? How can regulations help and serve this purpose? Engagement with traditional resource management organizations. We operate in the space with plants trade where the access to the resources, the issues of tenure and use rights, and interplay with customary norms and rules do play an important role, of course, in how the trade is regulated, how the good governance conditions are created, and that's such an essential part of making it work. We need more, greater, cheaper, effective technologies, whether it's for tracking the trade or identification. And there are some really excellent examples out there, and actually quite a lot of investment that fail in that space of how technology can help with trade. Enforcement actions. Talking about good laws, the other side of it is how do we actually check the compliance? What do enforcement officials know about it? And I think I'm nodding a little bit to a presentation later today, with some reflections about how enforcement for plant resources actually work, and are there difficulties in there as well? Procurement policies, extremely powerful way forward, I think, for at least for some of the resources. Timber purchases by a country, are regulated through public procurement policies. This is an excellent kind of lever of change and an opportunity to influence and bring in the good practices, as is engagement with industry and sectoral associations. Financial flows, we mentioned, we saw those diagrams of supply chains and, who's actually paying, how can we follow the money? Where are the insurers, where are the banks, what role they play in terms of financing companies that are involved in this trade? And again, the question of regulation is very pertinent there. How much the regulations that comes through, at an international level and, in terms of requiring certain things from investors, how much do they cover the issue of wildlife trade per se, but maybe plants in particular. On this, I'm going to stop and say thank you very much and open the floor maybe for 1 or 2 questions, because I know we've been speaking for a bit of time. And if you have any questions, maybe anyone online, and let's try to stop sharing. So maybe raise your hand if you have a question, and if you don't have questions, we'll carry on with some more talking this end. Maybe not. Okay, going all right? You still? Everybody's good? Good. Good to see those of you on video. Brilliant. Okay. Anyone in the room have any questions?
Okay, I have more a comment really on Tanya's presentation, just about bias, or apparent bias. Let's think about that. So there's a few quick points. One is a lot of one response to a lot of legislation relates to forest conservation and forest protection, which is not often species focused. So there's going to be quite a lot of applicable legislation, forest legislation or other habitat-related legislation. So that's an interesting thing about why is that approach taken to plants, or not exclusive to plants, but an area-based approach. And I think it cast your mind back to when people wrote some of this legislation. It's a lot to do with different attitudes of those involved in forest protection versus those interested in species protection, and where they came together. So that's one point. Second thing is, I think the bias is interesting, that if you spoke to experts in fungi or insects, they'd probably say that plants have a little bit time of legislative protection, particularly around trade legislation. So that's just worth noting. Then finally, on trade regulation, of course, trade regulation is meant to be responsive to a trade-related threat, the trade-related aspect of an over-exploitation threat, theoretically, but not always. Sometimes legislation is passed simply because people think a plant size or an animal is charismatic, rather than it actually being threatened specifically. But obviously, trade-related threats by themselves often relate to the attractiveness, the desirability of a species, which for some species might be because of its physical properties, but for a lot of them, orchids and cacti, for example, the reason they're in the appendices is because of their attraction to the trade. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy for those species, why they're being protected. Anyway, just some, and also just a comment, I couldn't agree more about the CITES legislation project, but unfortunately, the policy reality is, while a lot of countries still don't have good scores on that system, they will object to any increase or raising of the bar or raising of the threshold, because there'd definitely be a long way from qualifying. But anyway, thanks for the introduction and for the other talks.
Thank you.
Didn't want to respond. Okay. And sorry, I hope you can hear us again now. We have various microphone systems here, so this is our test of hybrid meeting. But one of the points I just wanted to note that somebody, Katya, I think, put a comment in chat about fungi, not a single fungi species being listed on CITES. And I don't know if you missed this. It was one of the points you made was just that how little, fungi or insect groups are covered by trade-related regulation in comparison to plants even is quite amazing. Good. Okay. Well, I don't see any other hands, so we're going to switch back into 2 more presentation mode, and then promise we're all going to be speaking more to each other. So first, Caitlin Schindler.
Is the right? Let's see if we can switch over easily.
You talk a little to right, not that much, but just so you don't disappear behind the mark.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm Caitlin Schindler. I'm the Plants Trade Program Manager at Traffic. I'm going to talk today about one of the projects within our portfolio of Traffic, some of the projects that I manage, which is called Wild at Home. So it aims to inform businesses and consumers about the wild plant ingredients in our everyday products. So one of the topics, many topics that we've covered, that aims to support the responsible sourcing. So we keep coming back to this topic of plant blindness, and this issue is really at the root of everything that we're covering. So like we've said in the other presentations as well, so plants are being obscured across all sorts of different stakeholders, and I understand we'll cover this in our next presentation as well. But just to note in brief all the different types of stakeholders which are relevant to this project as well. So for businesses, we know that really paying attention to their wild plant ingredients in particular. There are best practice standards available for what good sourcing of wild harvested plant ingredients looks like, so like Fair Wild, for example. But many businesses aren't ready to take that step towards certification because they haven't even gotten to thinking about these ingredients yet. Researchers are per area, so there's a lack of attention like we saw in red listing as well for wild plant ingredients, and even linked to a lack of funding interest on these types of ingredients, which are harvested for commercial purposes. On the government side, there we saw as well from Tanya's work, so they're missed out of all the wildlife focused work and definitions. And for investors as well, which Nancy touched on, the risks that have to do with wild harvested plant ingredients are just not on their radar. So, yeah, in many cases, the reason that these plant ingredients aren't on their radar, it's really basic factors. So they're missing information like, what are these ingredients? Why do they deserve our attention? Where do they come from? Who harvests them? What are their associated risks? Who cares about their responsible sourcing, and why do stakeholders like businesses actually need to act on them? So to overcome some of these barriers, Traffic has been working under this Wild at Home project, which, as I said, it aims to support various types of stakeholders towards becoming more aware of the wild ingredients in our everyday products, and then working to improve their sourcing, their sustainability, and their ethics. So on this slide, we have two of the key resources produced by this project. So if we start on the top right here, this is the Wild Check platform. So it's aiming to be like a one-stop shop for information on wild harvested plant ingredients. It's quite brief, it's really tailored to an industry audience, so it's fairly high level, and it focuses on these risk and opportunity profiles on a selection of 12 wild ingredients. So essentially it really details the how and the why that we should be acting. And that platform is coming soon in July. It's not quite live yet. But the platform is complemented by the Wild Check report, which is out now, just published last month. Which is essentially a longer form version of the platform. So it contains more details on production, trade, and risk assessment methodologies. It contains these red, amber, green, biological, and social risk assessments on these 12 flagship wild ingredients. And importantly, it also talks about the opportunities that can be seized through their responsible sourcing. So again, Nastia touched on some of these examples, but some supporting broader wildlife conservation and improving livelihoods of harvesters were often from marginalized communities. There are also, just noting, so there are specific opportunities listed in the report for different types of stakeholders as well. So the main target audience for the report is industry and businesses, because they have a really important role to play in responsible sourcing and improving these ingredients. But there's also actions in there tailored towards different audiences like policymakers, practitioners, even consumers and producers. So we'll look at that report. So coming on to those 12 flagship ingredients that I mentioned,
So we have a look at, there's thousands of wild plant ingredients that are in trade, and the question of where to begin can be quite overwhelming when you're looking at thousands of species. So to help overcome this challenge, we selected these 12 flagships, which you can see on the screen here. And how did we select them? So they are all ingredients that are important in trade, although not necessarily the largest in volume. There's quite a variety. They act as flagships of the opportunities and challenges of wild sourcing, essentially. So they're used across different types of industries as well: food, drink, medicine, beauty, industrial purposes. They're harvested from a variety of different geographies, as you can see, and by different types of communities. And they're also at various stages of attention, you could say, or protection. So some are CITES listed. We do have littleback on there, which was the green symbol earlier. And then some are not. Some are recently assessed on the IUCN Red List. Some are not assessed at all. Some of them, their last assessment was in 1998, so quite out of date. So yeah, at its basis, this is a list of, or a selection of species that are important in trade, that are mostly wild harvested, some are a little bit mixed, and that as a whole, they provide a representation of trade in wild plant non-wood forest products. So these are the species that we focus on within the Wild Check report and the platform. So coming on to the approach that we used to assess them. So we focused on those flagships, and then we thought, how can we get people to pay attention to them, and especially the types of audiences that we're trying to target? And how do we establish that we need to be paying them more attention urgently? So we decided to use this risk-based approach, and we conducted these biological and social risk assessments for each of those wild dozen species. The reason that we used this approach is because we know that industry is already doing a lot of work around responsible sourcing of some more popular commodities, so things like palm oil or seafood that we know quite well. And they tend to understand and act on these through a risk lens, essentially. So they consider the severity and the likelihood of the risks around these types of ingredients, alongside how important the commodity is to their business and the volumes that they use of it. So, and using this approach also puts into quite simple language, red, amber, green assessments, how urgent it is to act on these ingredients for various reasons, which can also help to get other stakeholders' attention as well, not just businesses. So putting those risk assessments into action, these are our results from the Wild Check report. So it's important to note that these are high-level assessments. They're at a national level. It doesn't imply that things are definitely happening in supply chains, but as risk assessments are, it kind of shows the areas that we should be looking into more in supply chains and where there could be risks of things and how serious they might be. So yeah, looking across the results, I would say they surprised us a bit, especially looking at the social risks. You can see there's a lot of highs on there. The methodology that we used is similar to what we know food businesses within the UK and North America are using. So this puts these types of ingredients on a similar plane to those other more popular or more paid attention to ingredients. The reason that the social risks are high, it's for a variety of reasons. For example, some of these are sourced from conflict regions. They could be operating with dangerous processing conditions, like we saw with little wax. A lot of cases, there's low pay to the harvesters or unstable rates of pay. And also there's potential for discrimination against different types of communities and women as well, who are often involved with the harvest. So essentially, looking across these surprising results clearly demonstrates the urgency of acting on these ingredients, and noting also that the biological risk assessments are particularly helpful where red list assessments are not available or are out of date. So it gives us a frame of reference to think about these species even where there's not a robust assessment available. And so we looked at the biological and social risks associated with these species, and this is kind of the hook that we use to get people to pay attention to them. But critically, when we were putting together this project and this report, we want to ensure that WildCheck doesn't just highlight the risks of these species and kind of push the trade away from them. So we know that wild ingredients can be so important culturally, for livelihoods of the harvesters, for a variety of reasons, the communities that harvest them. They can also be a tool for supporting broader wildlife conservation on a landscape scale. And I'll come on to some examples of that in the next few slides. But for these kind of seemingly small or minor ingredients that can sometimes fall down the ingredients list or be buried, so they seem like they're small or minor, but they actually have a disproportionately high potential to influence livelihoods or impact on wildlife conservation. So we really wanted to highlight the opportunities that are available within responsible sourcing of these wild plant ingredients and leave it on a positive spin for taking action. Because, yeah, there are cases that can be really feel good, win-win. If a business can highlight them, it contributes to their CSR strategies, for example. They can talk to their consumers about it, and at the same time, it's actually doing good for wildlife conservation and the harvester communities. So I'll come up to just two examples. I kind of wish I would have covered Dandelion wax because that's such a great one, but you've already talked about it. So we'll look at two different ones. So the first one we'll look at is Brazil nut. So these are nuts that are exclusively wild harvested from the Amazon region. They come from these very tall trees, which take several years to start producing fruit and nuts. They have been attempted to be cultivated, but they actually rely on their rainforest ecosystem to be productive and produce nuts. So yeah, they're entirely wild harvested. It's a good kind of flagship ingredient because it's one that consumers are probably aware of. You might recognize Brazil nuts from nut mix that you're eating, or they're sometimes mixed into granola. They can be in ice creams or confectionaries. And actually the oil is increasingly being used as in cosmetics as well. So they tend to come from Brazil, as you might assume with the name, but also Bolivia and Peru. And the harvester communities that collect them are quite different. It really depends on the region that you're looking at. So in some cases, they're collected by local or indigenous groups, and in some other cases, so for example, if there's a commercial landowner, you can have migrant workers who are brought into temporary camps to harvest the nuts. And the harvesting occurs once the nuts have fallen to the forest floor. So looking at the risks for this one, so the biological risk came out as medium and the social risk came out as high. Just to really high level summarize those risks. So there's quite a clear link with the case of the Brazil nut between this environmental issue, again, that consumers know quite well. So deforestation of the Amazon region is threatening the existence of these trees, but also their productivity. So I mentioned that they rely on a healthy ecosystem to produce nuts and to disseminate. I mentioned that some migrant workers live in temporary camps when they're harvesting the nuts. So in those cases, there have been cases found where this accommodation was remote and also unsuitable. So for example, no access to clean drinking water, lack of adequate shelter. And in some cases as well, the migrant workers would bring their families with them to these camps. So there is some risk of child labor involved as well. There are, in the worst cases, there are indicators of some certain cases of modern slavery. So there was a case detailed in Bolivia where migrant workers became indebted to the recruiters who had brought them into the region, and because of that, they had to continue working for that person to pay off their debt. So that's called debt bondage, and it's an indicator of a form of modern slavery. So some quite critical labor issues that have to do with Brazil nuts. And also, yeah, I touched on some of the health and safety aspects, but
There's also, because I mentioned the workers wait for the nuts to fall to harvest them. They're in these quite heavy, almost like a coconut shape, so, and they fall from high heights. So there is a risk actually if there's not proper health and safety equipment worn that workers could be killed by falling nuts. So there's a lot of different things to consider there in the biological and social risks. There are lots of great opportunities that this can be balanced out with through responsible sourcing. So I already mentioned the link to Amazon rainforest conservation. So if a business or a different type of stakeholder was working to conserve these trees, they can also be contributing to broader conservation of the Amazon and that healthy, very important ecosystem. By ensuring that harvesters work in better conditions and working towards that, they can also enable local and sustainable livelihoods for the livelihoods of migrant workers who often don't have many other earning opportunities. There's also opportunities to engage with other ongoing work in the regions as well. So there's one group we found, which is called the Sustainable Nut Initiative, that's already working on the sustainability and ethics of Brazil nuts. So through stakeholders engaging with these broader groups, it ensures that their actions are more long-lasting and more impactful. And then there's also quite a few producer unions and cooperatives with Brazil nuts. So working through those is a more structured and kind of more impactful way that we can work towards improving working conditions for the harvesters. So our second example is gum arabic. So this is an ingredient which tends to be in a lot of fizzy drinks, but also a number of other uses as well. So it's one of those funny ingredients which you see, which is an E number. So it's used across the food industry for all of these funny things. So an emulsifier, a stabilizer, a clouding agent. I just found it a couple of weeks ago in the shells of some mini eggs. So it's really quite a widespread one, and yeah, for a huge variety of uses, but one that really flies under the radar. So the ingredient, gum arabic, is harvested from two types of trees, and it's actually the sap of the trees or the exudate. And the top exporting countries are Sudan, Chad, and Nigeria. So again, we have a biological risk of medium and a social risk of high. Just again, to really briefly summarize the risks. So the trees are threatened by both overharvesting and climate change. So it's one that can, again, link into companies' broader sustainability goals, thinking of the climate change lens. The overharvesting is also linked to working conditions for the harvesters. So if they don't have many other earning opportunities, if they don't have a stable price, it might lead them to needing to overharvest the trees. The top exporting countries that I mentioned are they're conflict regions, some of them, so they are considered high risk for child labor and forced labor. It's important to note with this that we looked at country level indicators, so it's not that there were cases of child labor or forced labor found specifically with gum arabic harvesting. It's more that sourcing from those regions, we need to be aware of these risks and conduct due diligence, I guess, more carefully considering those issues. And yes, I already touched on, so low pay for the harvesters of gum arabic was a kind of widespread issue with this ingredient. But again, so some great opportunities that can be taken advantage of. So contributing to landscape restoration, linking into that climate change aspect. There's been a lot of efforts around this Great Green Wall recently to stop the desertification in the Sahel region of Africa. So that's protecting existing trees or planting additional ones. Can have these kind of multiple or multifaceted benefits of stopping desertification, contributing to landscape restoration, creating earning opportunities for marginalized people, and lots of good impacts of that. So linked to that as well, so supporting income generation for vulnerable groups. So the harvesters are quite mixed for gum arabic, but a lot of groups that would be considered vulnerable to things like price fluctuation and low pay, and also potential abuse through that. Pursuing certification is also, of course, an option for any wild harvested ingredient, but it's important to note as well because
just going back to the beginning of the presentation, a lot of businesses aren't ready to go for certification, but a lot of the standards like Fair Wild are freely available, and they can be used as a sort of gap analysis to see where the harvest needs to improve to become better for the people and the ecosystems. So bringing it all to a close, we have a flavor of what the profiles look like within WildCheck. And so thinking about how we're going to use that valuable information to engage with the right audiences and get them more aware of these ingredients. So some of the activities that we're working on now within the project, we're working to engage with industry with these profiles. How we're trying to do that is looking at by sector, so for example, focusing on the beauty sector, or even narrowing down on specific ingredients. So like gum arabic, for example, it's one that's really come under the radar, and one that could be a really significant risk, but also opportunities for the businesses that are using it. We're also working on some partnerships to engage with consumers and increase consumer awareness of these ingredients. We need to work from different angles because businesses won't pay attention until consumers do, but consumers won't pay attention because we're not aware of these ingredients yet, that they're even in the product. So we're coming at it from multiple angles to try to raise awareness overall and increase action. For the future of the project, we are considering expanding the list of the Wild Dozen, so we've already started the list of more species that could act as good flagships. Also looking at, well, already engaged with some supply chain improvements via local partners, so some more localized projects. We've got one running in Nepal at the moment, for example, focused on Jatamansi, but looking to see if we can engage in more of these types of projects around the Wild Dozen species. And then a policy engagement at the end, because it's an area that we really haven't started to think of that much yet, but within the lens of this project, I should say, but that we're keen to explore today as well through the discussions. So I will leave it there, but that's our project email address as well. I would like to
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And we have one last, but not least, presentation. And excitingly, we're going to test the hybrid situation to the limit by inviting Carly to speak online. And hopefully it will all work magically. And we can see your screen, which is amazing.
There we go. You can hear me now too, I hope.
Yes, perfect. We don't have, it's not a full screen yet. Oh, there you go.
Yes?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, holding thumbs. Let's hope this goes smoothly. Apologies everyone for not joining you in person in the room, but life happens and I'm stuck at home. I will whiz through my presentation. I feel a lot of what I have to say and in my slides has already been said, but I would certainly like to start with sort of an overview of what I'm going to run through, particularly speaking about plant blindness and how this affects the survival of plants with the illegal trade in species. Just touch briefly on CITES. I think I'm preaching to the choir here. Most of us know about CITES. The challenges for conservation and then some way forward, particularly with enforcement for illegal wildlife trade. So the first picture on the screen, you have a look and your first instinct, what do you see? And, you know, speak honestly to yourselves. For most of us, it is the elephants that you see, and not so much the baobabs that the elephants are actually destroying. So yes, plant blindness is there, and even for those of us who do work with plants on a regular basis, it's just there. But why is it this way? Why do we see things like this? And it could be, as Tanya mentioned, the definition of wildlife. She looked at legislation, but in general, terminology and coming through our schooling systems, and we refer to wildlife, it's often the examples given are the big mammals, the megafauna, and not so much even the small animals, the insects and the plants. Most don't even get a shining or a mention. So why is this? Well, plant blindness, it's not an old term. It was coined about 20 years ago. And as my previous presenters have said, it's an underrepresentation of plants, but it can be linked to a physical aspect of the human eye in that we see green much easier than any other color, and thus we become lazy and we don't look for it. It just becomes the filter and the background for most other things that stand out. So it's hardwired into us, along with the psychophysical aspect, in that animals were a threat to our ancestors. We often had to run away from them or we'd be eaten. Generally, we didn't have to run away from the trees unless they were falling on us. So it's hardwired that we're looking for movement, for colors that are a threat. So yellow. Now on my screen, I've got a field of yellow, and that is canola growing in South Africa actually, but right now in the UK, we've got fields of rape and mustard, which are very similar, and it just blends. And we're not going to run away from that yellow. We think it's very pretty, and our eyes are attracted to it. But when you see something moving towards you that could be yellow and fluffy with claws and teeth, it's generally a lion, and you're going to run. So plant blindness is a hardwired aspect into people, and we have to move away from it, and it's hard. So we shouldn't be too hard on others when they don't see plants. So for this aspect, we've actually made the problem even worse in that with urbanization, we've moved away from natural areas. So we see even less plants in the different versions of green. And this is called the nature deficit disorder. And it's directly linked to plant blindness in that the youth who grow up in dense urban centers that don't interact with plants no longer see them because it's not something that they see regularly. So there is a double-edged sword. When you see lots of green and plants en masse, such as the picture on the right of the screen and the house, you don't see the trees. They just blend. But when you don't see plants regularly, you don't see them at all. So we have to, as conservationists, try and tackle both these aspects. The green, don't know how we tackle that, and the psychophysiological, which is hardwired into us for survival mechanisms. Now, illegal wildlife trade is directly affected by plant blindness in the fact that, as it's been mentioned, plants have high economic value, but they are under-recognized in illegal wildlife interventions. The plant trade is worth so much more than the trade in the animals, yet it's not recognized. And it's not funded when it comes to illegal plant trade, whereas animals do get a lot more funding. And you'll hear this throughout my talk, as it's a key factor in conservation and tackling IWT. So other than plants, we're talking about timber. A lot has been spoken on timber, and there's very little research done on timber as well as plants. For instance, cycads, and I see some of our participants here from South Africa, so you'll certainly know these species, but they're considered high risk from illegal trade, and they are the most endangered plant group on the planet. Yet, researchers who I know are working on aspects of illegal wildlife trade for cycads battle to get funding for these plants. They are not recognized. You don't see them on billboards when a cycad has been poached from the wild and there's nothing left, or there's only males left and no females, and it's pretty much going to go extinct. It's not out there in the public. And then enforcement agencies are not funded or trained regarding illegal plant trade. It's not seen as a priority. It's sometimes seen as too difficult. The technologies aren't there, but the funding isn't there to develop the technologies. So it's quite a vicious circle, and we need to try and break this circle. Speaking of circles, I have two on the next slide. So these just show the scale of illegal wildlife trade. Illegal wildlife trade is an imminent threat to plants and animals. It is the third largest illegal trade in the world, and it often uses the same supply chains as drugs and weapons. Many of you already know this and have worked in these fields. Yet, once again, even wildlife trade, not so much plants or animals, is underfunded, and there's very little to date. I know there is work between these various groups, but there's very little interaction between illegal wildlife trade, illegal arms trade, human trafficking, and the narcotics and drug trade. Yet they all use the same supply chains. Generally, the same syndicates are involved. Excuse me. The slide or the donut on the right, is from the recent UNODC Wildlife Trade Report. And we've put this in our UK Wildlife Trade Report as well, as it shows the volume of seizures in kilograms of illegal traded groups. As we've said, animals get split down individually. This has been grouped into timber, which is 66% of all seizures, plants and derivatives, 26%, oriental medicines of 5%, mainly consisting of plant-based products. The remaining 3% is animals and corals. Yet you don't see these kind of stats coming out when big organizations are looking for funding or in the media and the press. It's just really not there at the moment. So the impacts on plant conservation of plant blindness, illegal wildlife trade, is that the illegal wildlife trade interventions focus on the international trade of charismatic endangered animals, particularly elephants, rhinos, tigers, pangolins, even some niche species that hit the headlines and are very cute and cuddly. Often international reports, there are few photographs of plants, yet more plants are going extinct each year than the animals. And trade is one of those main drivers, which was mentioned this morning as well, also mentioned in the IPBES report. So plant blindness, not surprisingly, results in underappreciation of plants, limited interest in funding for plant conservation. We know many plant courses in ecology, biology, botany are being closed due to lack of funding and support. Students just aren't wanting to go there and do those courses. And sometimes even funding for conservation, for animal conservation, has a negative impact on plant conservation, such as the planting of trees for food for elephants, or clearing for bamboo for pandas in biodiverse habitats of other plant species. And just as an example, that public funding for plant science is drying up, and that, you know, even though where there are calls to fund plant-based illegal wildlife trade research, very few applications are received. And in the recent IWT Challenge Fund, there were 5 plant-focused applications of all the applications, which were roughly about 140 that came in the last round, and 5 of them were focused on plants. Others mentioned plants as off-spin and benefit species of targeted, focused animal interventions, but not plants. So, CITES, I'm not even going to read the slide because I know that you can all read and you know what CITES is. But CITES, and the purpose of CITES, which I'd like to highlight, is to ensure that fauna and flora are not exploited through international trade. Now, CITES is a living convention. It changes and adapts over time, listing, uplisting, delisting species. But enforcement and compliance issues aren't addressed as readily as wanting to uplist species. Uplisting species is great, but how do we actually have sustainable trade? CITES is important for sustainable trade. It's not banning all trade. It's actually promoting trade. And there's this misunderstanding that CITES is there to actually just stop trade. And it's to promote sustainable trade. And this is where Wild Check and Fair Wild and certifications certainly come into play and need to be working in conjunction with CITES. CITES, as I mentioned, is restricted to international trade, and often trade is domestic. And when someone in industry sees the demand and the potential of domestic trade, it becomes international trade. And influencers and the social media platforms can just make this happen so quickly that we can't keep up in CITES, because CITES can be a little slow. So CITES can actually be affected by plant blindness, which I'll get to on my next slide, but it also can affect itself. So we need to address this. And I do believe that the national legislation needs to be addressed. But as I think was Steve in the room mentioned, that there's a lot of countries who it's going to be hard. Let's put it that way. So the CITES appendices species are listed according to their degree of protection that they need, and this is not dependent on a conservation status assessment, as we heard this morning. So currently, Kew are doing an assessment of all the species that do not have IUCN Red List status that are listed on CITES, except, here's my caveat, except for 4 orchid species. So we're doing 4 orchids, not the rest. Please don't get too excited. The reason for the orchids not having a Red List assessment is that other people are still doing a few of the orchids in niche groups. Many aren't named to species level. There's many hybrids and cultivars, and we need to navigate our way taxonomically through those. There are also many species that are under-collected of the orchids and under-researched. So there's not a lot of data on them other than maybe one herbarium specimen and a description of where it was once found. It could even have been found, and there are examples, in a marketplace. And we're actually not even sure where they are growing in the wild. They could pin it down to a country, but that's about it. Research applications that have gone in, and particularly Kew, I know my colleagues, we've sent them in. There's no appetite to fund that kind of work, to go and map species, to find out where the orchids are growing, what the population sizes are. It's just not exciting, or plant blindness is coming in and they can't compete, even though orchids are one of those species that are actually quite pretty and can stand out amongst the crowd. Sorry. So the challenges of CITES is mainly the internet. So as I've said, CITES is an older convention, it is dynamic, but there's still old systems. There's still paper-based systems and physical border checks in an electronic world. And this does not help when you have the mass of trade happening online nowadays, and particularly in plants, because they can be posted without them squirming around and trying to break out the box, unlike animals. Unfortunately, they get posted too. But plants do lend themselves to being posted a little bit easier than some animals. The internet, although a great benefit for us for research, here I am, I can't be there in person, I'm online, I can share my information and my story with you. It does offer anonymity to anyone selling online. So there's difficulty, if I could put it mildly, in tracking supply chains. There's also difficulty in identifying species online before they arrive at a destination through pictures, because pictures can be falsified, photoshopped, or completely a different species altogether. And the last thing about the internet is, whose jurisdiction is it in cyberspace? Is it the range state or the origin country? Is it the destination, the seller, the buyer, the intermediary? So prosecuting and enforcing CITES on the internet is proving to be extremely difficult. Although the light at the end of the tunnel is the new collaborations that are working with the big platforms on the internet to highlight this illegal trade. Great work has been done, and it has certainly worked for ivory and rhino horn. We do need to work on the plant aspect of it, because some of the platforms are even plant blind, not realizing that plants other than timber also need to be regulated, because timber is regulated. Even Alibaba's pulled some of their timber off of their platforms, but not all of it. So another challenge with regulating plant trade and CITES is the number of specimens that need CITES permits. And I've listed a few here, but it's pretty much everything. So as a trader or industry, how do you know? You've got to navigate very complex and complicated regulations, not written for general reading and consumption. You have to know what you're looking for. You have to be an expert. And if you are plant blind, you really don't want to go down this route and find a permit. You'd rather take the risk and ship it illegally. Even though it's a high value commodity, it's worth taking the risk. And we've had these interviews. I've sat with some of my enforcement colleagues in interviews where they've caught people and suppliers and shippers, and they've said as much. So they don't want to deal with any of this detail, if I could say that, tissue culture spores, and that kind of thing. Once again, preaching to the choir, rosewoods, as Sarah has mentioned, niche timber, certainly high in demand, and they account for 40.7% of all IWT seizures. This is a 5% or 5.7% increase from the last UNODC report that also had rosewoods being the predominant seizure in all the other species. But if you consider how many times you see rosewood timber on the press or used as a flagship to look at illegal wildlife trade, and yet maybe fund a rhino or pangolin, and you see them used on posters and TV, it's just perpetuating the plant blindness. And I think as conservationists in the flora realm, we should be promoting pictures, okay, well, pictures like this, but this is what attracts people. We want gore, we want red, we want the sensationalism. And we use this picture quite often at Kew, and it does attract a lot of attention. The red rosewoods, the red markings on the trees. And then the questions start, oh, is this illegally traded? If you had a picture of a rhino there, people would also be asking the questions. But we need to look at our pictures and break the plant blindness, the green. We need to look for the other colors that are going to attract the people and then get the hook and get the stories. These are just some pictures of seizures that we've had in the UK, and pictures illustrating plant blindness. So timber is often not seen as timber or wood by customs officers, believe it or not, and industry. They somehow forget that it comes from a tree. Maybe they can't see the wood for the trees, that old saying. So the picture on the top left, the container load of flooring boards, which were seized at the port. Now, those were inspected, they're wood. That's fine. Next to it is a Bentley, which was fixed up for a well-known rapper in the UK. It was seized because the timber paneling inside was rosewood, and they had no permit. Yet, it wasn't Bentley, but those who then took the Bentley car and fixed it up claimed that there was no CITES species, and they didn't know anything about this. They had only used some paneling, and it happened to be wood, and it happened to be rosewood. So definitely plant blind. And then the picture at the bottom is a ship which was retrofitted and then brought into the UK waters. It was signed off, but then just it so happened that one of the CITES inspectors was there at the time at the port, and he said, is there any permits for any of this wood on the ship? And they said, well, the ship is made of wood. And like, yes, you need permits for it. And no one had thought to ask about those questions. Another challenge is looking at wild versus artificially propagated or cultivated species, particularly online. The technical challenges are unique to plants when opposed to animals sometimes, and this is certainly one of them in telling if a species at the border is wild, harvested, or artificially propagated. Often, even as an expert, it's difficult to tell. The picture in the center is from Esti, and it is an Areocarpus, wild harvested from Mexico, and you can see that it's been wild harvested. And we actually have provided guidelines to Border Force officials to look at this kind of thing and looking at trade online. So these are the kind of things that we see that are seized with regularity, if I could actually say that, at the UK borders. And you'll notice that most of them are fairly easy to find, particularly the prickly, spiky ones. So, what is found is easy to find. The difficult things, often they go through, or you have to have someone who's really interested in plants and well-trained. And here is going back to the funding, that there's often not a lot of funding to train enforcement officers in identifying plant species being illegally traded, the different avenues that they can use. On the screen is a shot of a black bucket with some little pouches in the bottom of it. That was a potted plant. In the bottom were seeds of cycads, and there's the open packet on the far right of the screen in the black bag. So cycads were being smuggled within another pot plant, which was just a regular pot plant. And we did have a sniffer dog there at the time that was trained on cycads. Otherwise, they probably would have got through. But working in conjunction between Q and other enforcement agencies has really helped break the plant blindness cycle. What we need is more technology to look at plants. There's a lot of work that's been done on animals. The pictures on the screen show X-ray technology that's used for rhino horn and ivory, that it actually shows up different colors when it is pure ivory and rhino horn, and it works really well. Something like this needs to be looked at for plants. Sensor sniffers or swabs that they use similar to drug detection, and as I mentioned, even sniffer dogs trained to detect particular plants and species that are being trafficked. So looking at the way forward, we need to support the conservation of plant species in their own right and not lump them with animals. And it's hard because there's a lot of discussions now around ecosystem services and supporting ecosystems, but we do need to recognize the plants for their own conservation right. We need to be aware of species that are in IWT trade, and as we've also mentioned, species that could then also be substitutes for those that are either diminishing or enforcement is actually quite strict on them, and traders, illegal traders, are actually just moving to the next appropriate species. When looking online, we need to look at when a deal looks too good to be true. Often that's illegal trade, and just training people in identifying when a deal for a plant looks too good. It probably is, and it's been harvested from the wild. We need to encourage people to check Species Plus, and I've got the UK CITES websites, but generally CITES website, there's great information on many of the websites across the world that can help traders. We need to encourage them and provide resources for them. We need to develop innovative efforts to highlight impacts of illegal plant trade. And on this slide, I've got pictures of orchids which look like things, and it attracts people to them, and you can associate with those species because they've got a human element to them. And we need to promote identification and empathy of plants, bringing people in interaction with plants, either social media and the press, or getting them out into urban spaces, green spaces, wild areas. So thank you. And yeah, thank you to many who are online or in the room. A lot of the information has come from work that you've done and added to. And yeah, thank you very much.
That was fascinating. Thank you. So we have a few minutes now before a break, and we're going to take a break here, and we'll offer a break to everyone else. We might have some coffee here, maybe. So I just wanted to give an opportunity for any comments or questions that you have to Carly and Caitlin, or any other observations. I can see one. Hey, Vivian.
Hi there. Yeah, I just wanted to thank Carly for her presentation, and I wanted to, as I'm Vivian Williams, by the way, from South Africa, and I've been working in the medicinal plant trade for about 30 years now, documenting trade in traditional medicine in local markets and looking at what species are being harvested and from not only South Africa but cross-border. I think linked to this issue of plant blindness is what Tony Cunningham referred to as the hidden economy. And in the 1990s, he was referring to the medicinal plant trade in South Africa as this hidden economy, and there's all sorts of reasons for it being hidden. One part obviously being the nature of the transaction, and that this massive trade happens in the region at levels we haven't really probably got to grips with, and the scale of it and the monies involved, etc., have been quite difficult to quantify. I would say that South Africa is probably one of the least plant-blind countries. And I think that's thanks to the researchers we have, and including people like Tilla, who's worked very hard with the Threatened Species Programme to have our, the species that are used red listed, not only the species that we use, but in fact, South Africa's entire flora, amongst other things. And I think legislation is built into, South Africa has legislation concerning what permits one needs in order to be in possession of plants to carry out restricted activities. It's one of that sets of legislation is called, you need a TOPS permit, as they call it, a permit for threatened or protected species. And my challenge here is that, there was a meeting about a month ago with Tasneem and Tilla, and I said, well, what I'd do is I'd go back and look at my research from the 1990s and start making a list of all the plants that I know were harvested in neighbouring countries. And so that we had some sort of idea of the scale of trade where plants harvested in neighbouring countries are brought into South Africa for the traditional medicine trade, which is a massive business here. And I didn't finish, but I kind of got to more than 60 species and stopped and thought, okay, I'm going to carry on another day. And then linked to this is something that I'm going to be doing next month for the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And one of the things that they're doing is providing training to Mozambican customs officials on species identification. And I was asked if I would just do a short presentation on medicinal species. So I said to them, well, look, tell me what the legislation is in Mozambique that makes it illegal to be in possession of plants. And I think the most they could come up with, or the most they could tell me, is to do with timber. So it seems, but maybe the subject to confirmation, that it isn't illegal to be in possession of species. So that at most, in my presentation to these officials next month, all I can do is say to them, look, if you find people crossing the border into South Africa with plants, if you know it's a CITES listed species, and like orchids and cycads and things like that, and they choose to go across the border, then you can obviously have them arrested. If it's not CITES listed, the most you then can do is say, well, look, if you go into South Africa, you risk being arrested if law enforcement catch you and you don't have this TOPS permit, and people transporting material or carrying out restricted activities need a TOPS permit for every province that they go in. And so they're in effect impotent, really, when it comes to what they can do. That's just part of it. And I think at the end of the day, though, those of us who work in the medicinal plant trade in South Africa feel this when you get people who depend on medicinal plants from a livelihood perspective and for, say, treating people, are criminalized. And I think criminalizing people for whom medicinal plant harvesting is a subsistence activity is something I'm actually very uncomfortable with. And so while on the one hand, we need this legislation and we need to be dealing with this problem that we have, I have a hard time. I'm conflicted at times, and it's actually this massive, wicked problem that we have to try and deal with. And I think different people have different jobs in this, and for some who are in law enforcement, they don't have to worry about what this is doing perhaps to the person being arrested. Their job is just to enforce the law. But I end up sitting on the fence sometimes, and like I said, coming from a country that's not plant blind, I feel impotent as a researcher. And in so many ways, in terms of what do we do and how do we deal with it. And, this is just one aspect I'm dealing with. And those of you sitting here are dealing with other aspects of this and probably have different kinds of pain with it, as well as what do we do with this massive problem. And I suppose we do it one species at a time, and we talk to each other and we see if there's some things that we can do for some species, and if it's. But the other part is that I remember Neil Crouch saying in the 1990s he doesn't really believe there's any such thing as sustainable utilization. And when you've got people in, say, in Southern Africa that I'm more familiar with, where they can't afford, where resources sometimes you can't afford to use them sustainably, but then you can't afford not to, because your livelihood depends on it, then this also becomes another challenge as well. So I guess we can do what we can, and sometimes we just have to say there's just some stuff that we can't do. So that's my little impassioned piece.
Thanks, Wyatt. That's great. And I think also, I could agree more. And I think the question about, we've done quite a lot of looking into the issue of corruption and trade in wild plant resources. And I think the issue around the under-regulation versus over-regulating the trade in some plant resources came out really, really strongly. What are the kind of perils of over-regulating the sector that's traditionally informal, and there are a lot of risks in that as well. I also feel this is a great contribution to what we're going to discuss specifically in breakout groups. So I hope you can stay and also share in there. I do see another hand. Hi, Deborah. Do you want to?
Sure.
Share?
Thanks, Nastia. At first, I'd just like to say thank you so much to everybody that's made these wonderful presentations. This has really been incredibly illuminating. I just wanted to make a brief comment as to how we really do need to look at both sides of the coin and two elements of solutions here. It is very important to have good regulation. It is very important to have really effective enforcement. I absolutely agree. But also, listening to what Vivian says, for example, the challenge is you can't be criminalizing people to whom their very subsistence depends upon the collection of these resources. And I think this is where, we at Fairwild try to play our little part. And thank you to the various people that have mentioned us as well, in that there are ways in which we can also complement and be the other half of the coin in finding and helping to promote sustainable supply chains. Sometimes, it often is feasible. It's not as like a dichotomy where this is sustainable harvest, this isn't sustainable harvest. We've got to work with the processes, work with supply chains, work to promote sustainable harvesting, both in ecological and in social terms, and have a private sector, consumer-based and production-based solution, as well as a regulatory solution. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that. That's great. And again, do stay along for the breakout groups, and we want those ideas captured and noted down. Carly, you have a response.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say, well, firstly, for Vivian, that example that I had on my slide of the cycad seeds, that was a shipment that came from Mozambique, but the seeds are from South Africa. So it went cross-border into Mozambique and then shipped out of Mozambique to the UK. So, we know that Mozambique didn't recognize the cycads, even though CITES cycads. So we also had worked with them now to identify. So it's just hit and miss and working with people that we can. But Deborah made a really good point. And CITES is working more with communities and recognizing that we need to identify cultural uses and governance structures and ownership of land, and not outright blanket, this is, the regulations and now you're doing it illegally, where for millennia they've done it that way and that's their culture. And there needs to be recognition of indigenous users and cultural rights and practices. And often those practices are sustainable. It's just the demand from maybe an international market that is now making it. So the demand is unsustainable. The harvesting practices that have been going on for ages are sustainable. To find the right balance is something that we need to do. And I think some of the first slides that were presented to us this morning with 11 points, I think, Nastia, that was one of yours, and Tanya put up some points. And that's also, it's recognizing historic use, cultural use, and the sustainable practices, because those populations of species have carried on being used that way, and some are reliant on that. And when you stop that, there's examples in Central Europe of species where harvesting has stopped because it's now been deemed it's illegal, and the species are in decline because the harvesting has stopped. So we really need to take the ecological and the cultural together. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This is great. I think between the three of you, you've covered all 4 questions that we have in breakout groups. So this is going to be excellent kickoff for the discussions. But before we go into breakout groups, and please, those of you online, I think we'll try to keep the doors closed here so people can't escape. But please don't go away. We're going to break for, is 10 minutes okay? I think we're going to break for 10 minutes. So we'll be back in 43, whatever costs an hour. So feel free to switch off your videos if you want to. And then Tanya will introduce the breakout groups. And then, and then we'll split into those and have a good discussion. Right.
I've split them out, so I haven't opened it yet. All right, hello everybody, we all back. I'm going to assume that we're all there online. It looks like there's 20 of you still. Amazing. So we're going to stick to our original time frame. So we're just going to take some time out of the breakout groups and stick to the schedule. So we'll end the breakout groups at 20 after, so 4:20 for those of us in the UK. There's going to be group 1, which is what are the barriers to plants being included in wildlife protection legislation, and that's for those of us in the room. That's what we're going to be talking about. And then the technological magician Audrey has put 3 groups together online, so you're going to be thrown into breakout groups. Group 2, what are the benefits and challenges to a sustainable use approach? What steps can be taken to improve existing legislation is group 3, and group 4, what are the mechanisms besides law? So we talked about regulation, but what else is there that can help this improve sustainable use? Katya, Megan, and Jared have kindly agreed to be the facilitators in each of those groups that are online, the 2, 3, and 4. So if they could either take notes themselves or have someone take notes, because you're going to feed back what you guys talked about at 4:20. If you, which I imagine you'll stick to your question the whole time, but if you get bored and want to talk about something else, you can move along to one of the other questions and then feed that back as well. So if anyone has any questions, you can pop it in the chat, or you can email me too, or if that works. So Audrey is going to open the breakout groups, and we'll meet back in this big room at 4:20. Thanks, everyone.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good conversation.
Yep.
Good. So, counter to the logic of the questions, so we wanted to start. How many of you came back? 18. Okay, a little less. So, counter to the logic of those questions that were meant to build out, I actually wanted to start from virtual groups because it's harder for you all to participate and also to hear from you. So, what if we start from group 2 with question 2, which was group 2?
I think Megan was leading.
Megan, was it you?
It was me. Sorry, I forgot where the mute button was. Yeah.
Do you want to give us a flavour of how the discussion went?
Yes. So we had people in different parts of like the sector, I guess, of illegal wildlife trade. And we kind of started off the discussions thinking about consumer demand and whether that can drive sustainable use. And so that was where we started from. And then we went, and so we were thinking about one of the challenges is understanding demand culture from consumers and how the impact that has on the species that is being consumed. and who you need to like target that research towards. Like, is it towards individual consumers, or is it towards sort of like the nurseries who are growing the plants and those sorts of things? And then Chen raised an interesting point that sometimes that demand is actually driven by the middlemen, so not by the planters or the suppliers, but actually by like people doing the processing or people doing the importing and exporting. And that if there is a way to identify those people and then influence and engage with those people, and that is a better way towards sustainable use and management of resources, because they're driving the demand to some extent. And as well as thinking about the culture of demand within the countries where all the species are being exported to, but also the culture of the suppliers and the harvest. And then other challenges, correct me if I'm wrong, but was about sometimes a lack of cooperation between governments. And so if there was more international governmental collaboration on like the banning of threatened groups, that could help towards more sustainable use, and it wouldn't mean that there was mining of one species in one country and not in another, and then overall the demand might change, the demand dynamics might change. And yeah, governments wanting to make sure that there's jobs and profit and industry, and the impact that that can have on species is a huge challenge, because if you're trying to influence a government that is driving trade to trade sustainably, that is a bit of an oxymoron. And we also had feedback from Purva in India, who was talking about the lack of direct data collection of species also being a challenge to sustainable use, because we don't know the quantitative aspects of a species and the numbers that it needs to be grown in, or even the numbers it needs to be harvested in. So there needs to be feedback between demand, like the consumers, the middlemen, and the growers, to make sure that the trade isn't, the harvest isn't unsustainable, but then there also isn't under harvest. So just kind of finding that balance again. And that there is a lack of participatory trade monitoring systems in place at different levels that can guide people on how to implement sustainable use. And again, sustainable frameworks as well. And then also considering the challenge of power dynamics between stakeholder groups, local communities, and how we can use those different stakeholders to deliver different types of change. So those were a lot of challenges. But then the benefits we discussed were, we spent a lot of time, Chen spent a lot of time explaining like the model of sustainable use within timbers, and how having lots of forestry policy and forestry law is actually good frameworks for potentially other threatened plant species in trade, because there's already a lot of research being done on timbers, and some are protected in trade, and that is a good framework for introducing buffer zones and mother trees, so harvest practices. And that sometimes it's easier to have these things put into law instead of them being participatory, because there's less roots around them. And then of the other benefits we spoke about were having long-term availability of resources, whereas illegal trade is often short-term because it's mining of a resource, and the greater recognition of plants, and the greater education of consumers, and the recognition that if you have a sustainable trade, you have a sustainable livelihood, and that is beneficial as well. So utilization benefits where everyone has access for a long time, and it's not just benefiting the few, but it's benefiting the many. I went through that quite quickly, but thank you to everyone in group 2. And if anyone from group 2 would like to respond, I open the floor to you. So yeah.
People hear me here, but I'm muted myself today. Thanks a lot for this. This is great. And I realized I should have probably read out what the question was that you discussed, just as a reminder. So as a reminder, this was a summary of discussion about what are the benefits and challenges to a sustainable use approach. Yeah. I don't know if this sparks, first, thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Does this spark?
Can I make a point?
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think one additional point I would just like to throw on the table, I think, it's not a spanner basically, but I think it's important to note that we are assuming that sustainability approaches would mean that it's always beneficial. It really depends, I think, on what perspective and angle you're coming from, because sometimes unsustainability is actually beneficial to certain stakeholders and so on. So looking at a power relationship between the different stakeholders, subsets of stakeholders and so on will be important, because who is benefiting will then be able to at least give us a better handle on whether sustainability, the way we want to see sustainability, can function well, or if not, it might be hijacked basically. And then that will create a lot of problems for us, because once it's codified by law and so on, it's very difficult to change, right? Because it's gone through the ball has rolled down the slope basically. So it's a lot of momentum to make any changes after the fact. Just a flag. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yes, the unsustainable use could also be beneficial to lots of different people, stakeholders. Is there? So the question was benefits and challenges to sustainable use approaches in plant resources of different kind. Is there any other reflections or comments from any other groups? Anyone here in the room or online? Maybe not. Okay, then let's move on to group 3. So group 3 have been answering a question: what steps can be taken to improve existing legislation or international conventions as far as trade in plants is concerned? And group 3 was
Jared.
Yep, it was me.
Go for it.
Thanks so much. We had a great conversation with Vivian Williams and Carson Smith Hall and Dr. Prasad Kulkarni and Clay Meredith and myself about ways that we can think about improving current legislation, but also conventions. We ended up focusing on a couple of specific, I would say, themes. Other folks from the group, feel free to add or correct me, but one of the first things we talked about was a missing gap at times between sort of international level in terms of trade conventions that namely CITES that operate at the international level between countries, and also national level legislation. So on the one hand, there's the problem of unevenness in terms of conflicts where one country has particular legislation and another country does not. When trade takes place between those two countries, that can create all kinds of problems that we've already talked about in part. But also times what's missed in a gap between these levels. So times needs for maybe more specific or even bilateral type agreements. There was a discussion of examples between sort of trade between Nepal and India, that it also involves state level legislation within India. I gave another example of issues in which kind of new and emergent trade in succulents from the US is struggling in terms of the fact that there's nothing actually taking place illegally in the country of destination of those plants, namely South Korea, which makes it very difficult for CITES officers in South Korea to really do anything about the problem. So on the one level, just kind of things we're already aware of in relationship to those gaps and mismatches between national level legislation. But also importantly, and this speaks to a lot of the key findings from Tanya Wyatt's work around just sort of abysmal implementation of existing conventions. So namely the lack of implementation of CITES at the national level across many countries. And so just one of the key issues being that without sort of more serious implementation of current trade convention rules, it sort of responses to these uneven kind of trades between countries is going to be largely hobbled in terms of using CITES as an international policy tool for responding to specific plant trades. And so just the issue of lack of implementation of existing conventions being a really key issue here that needs improvement. So not a need for additional legislation or conventions, but improving the ones that actually already exist. A key thing that we also talked about was the sort of resistance to knee-jerk responses in terms of thinking about enforcement and trade bans being necessarily a good thing. And especially when there's new and emergent trades, I think there's oftentimes sense from the conservation community that stopping trade is the adequate response, when in fact there's a lot of evidence that that can make illegal trade worse or bring in more dangerous or concerning actors into those trades. So we should think really carefully and cautiously about whether current legislation and bans that already exist are already actually doing good work before turning towards additional bans or pushing for more bans. So we know, for instance, there are examples of trade bans that aren't working for animals, and we know even less about whether or not trade bans are working effectively for plants. And so it might sound annoying to say we need more research, but we talked about a number of potential opportunities for collaboration here in terms of thinking about, can we think about ways of studying this where we look at the effect of the implementation, for instance, of new legislation to restrict or regulate trades in the actual on-the-ground realities of what occurs both before and afterwards, as maybe an important opportunity for some international collaboration or just research taking place in relationship to this. And then, yeah, I think actually that was the three main key kind of topics we focused on. If there's anything I folks feel I left out from our group, I'd be happy for you to chime in. Thanks, Nastya.
Thanks so much, Jared and the group. That's great. I think it's maybe on some issues that we're discussing group one as well, but really some really interesting ideas also for research and moving things forward. Would other groups have? Oh, Tanya, go for it.
Sorry, thank you. Good points that were raised by Jared's group, actually. I have two additional points to bring up about legislation and convention. One is that CITES, of course, is limited to the species that are listed in CITES, obviously. So it's good that we want to get CITES to be implemented well. I think that's a very good objective for us to achieve it. But it doesn't cover for all the species that we are wanting to look at. But at the national level, we know that many governments actually enact their own protected list for different species, including plants, because they've got specific reasons to do it, including banning, putting high tariffs for protection species, or limiting the exports, quotas, and so on and so forth. The challenge is that most other governments that are importing those species do not recognize those particular bans or restrictions and so on that's going on. Now, partly because of economic reasons, partly because of sovereign rights, and partly because, hey, I need jobs, the product is coming to my country, I need it for my processing, my industry and workers and so on. So forth. Now, if the governments can recognize it, and that's why we have CITES, so that they can recognize the permits that are issued by the other country. If they can actually recognize those legislations that are imposed already by the other countries that they're trading with, that will be a big help. Obviously, only the US have the US Lacey Act that allows that to happen, and a few other countries like EU legislation for the EU timber regulation and so on. But if more countries were to move along that lines, it will be a big help. Then at the national level, when you enact some protection list of species and so on, that will get a corresponding acknowledgement on the other side. The second point is that customs as the front line to look at all imports and exports. If they can, because to export, you need the release form, the customs form actually to be issued before that product is exported legally out of the country. And obviously, if there's a restriction to the species, customs of that country will not issue the customs form. But it is difficult to get the the importing customs to actually ask for that form, the customs form, because no one wants to be too transparent. Now, if you can find a way to increase the transparency in international trade, that will also be a big help. So these are parallel trends that can actually help from the legal perspective and a convention perspective, just for consideration. Thanks.
Sorry, Nastya, also, if I can, I forgot to summarize also one key other point, and this was what Prasad was bringing up. And this was especially related to his experience of engaging, especially, for instance, in the context of South India, with enforcement officers on the ground, like range forest officers, forest guards, for instance, folks who are actually responsible for enforcing laws on the ground, who aren't necessarily actually very informed in terms of their knowledge capacity of why these laws exist, and why, for instance, certain trades are happening, or kind of the sort of international scope of these conventions. So an important point he brought up was making sure that at the ground level, folks who are responsible for enforcing laws actually understand those laws and are, given the capacity to understand and implement them effectively and understand why. And part of that's a communication issue, but that's also to help build, I think, exchange relations then from the ground up as well, in terms of how are those laws being implemented on the ground. And if people don't understand those laws, why is that the case, and what can be sort of done to kind of improve that? And so that was another kind of key idea that came out of the group as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you. And anyone else? Because there were some really good ideas. I'm going to switch my train of thoughts and actually ask if Tanya could summarize what Group 1 was discussing, so that, because it flows sort of really nicely to think about the barriers to. Group 1 was talking about the barriers to plants being included in wildlife protection legislation, and I think it follows neatly and hooks into what Jared was just presenting back from the Group 3. And we'll jump to Group 4.
Can you hear me from here, or should I come up to the front?
Can you hear Tanya just now?
Okay, I'll stay here. So Sarah started us off asking a good question around where does property status and land use and land rights fit into all of this? And I don't know that we answered it very well, but there is other legislation, not just trade legislation or conservation or protection legislation, that's really relevant to plants. We talked about plants are sometimes considered immovable objects, so they're the property of wherever or whoever owns that land, or maybe that could be the state even. So that is also somewhere that could create barriers to protection if we're only thinking of plants as property. And we also talked about the complicated nature of this. So there's access issues as well, harvesting rights to resources in these permit systems that are overlaying on top of all of this other legislation. We also talked about legislation being written in a way that can't add plants. Sometimes just the very nature of how it's been drafted prohibits plants being protected. Also that wildlife authorities focus on one and not the other. So you might have one law enforcement or regulatory agency focused just on animals. Where does that leave plants? Maybe there's forestry or rangers or something. So that's another barrier with this complicated nature of regulation. Lack of evidential basis. The other two groups have talked about this too. Lack of data around, particularly around trade, that provides that information-based base to make good decisions, particularly around listings. We talked again about the ecosystem approach versus the species protection approach. Is possibly a barrier to species level protection, and having species criteria and then being threatened or not fit into an ecosystem approach, and that could be a possible challenge. An interesting point around social crossovers. What about labor regulations and rights? What about that legislation actually providing some benefit to wildlife protection? We talked a bit about the Modern Slavery Act or fair trade, how those might play a role in this. And then some of the big barriers that we talked about of just capacity in countries. That could be financial or human resources, the complexity of the legislation, the political will, the priority around wildlife. Sometimes countries just, have other problems that are listed above wildlife, so they're not improving their legislation, so they're not creating or drafting usable legislation. We also talked quite a bit about industry and how there's, if you have an industry that's attentive to all of this, it might be of benefit to actually improve legislation and move things forward. But if it's a more informal trade, that might be a barrier to that wildlife, that plant being sustainably harvested. Lots of other good stuff here. But yeah, and then we talked about corruption being a barrier as well to legislation. Maybe that's in industry corruption, but it could be governmental corruption too. Someone's benefiting from the trade, so they're going to block good legislation coming into practice. And there's an example of the big leaf mahogany that we briefly talked about. Yeah, I think so. Lots of good stuff that overlaps with folks from other groups. If I missed anything, do please jump in, anyone in the room. Anyone? Thanks a lot. That was great. Anything that Jen, go for it.
Sorry. Okay. Just an additional point, probably, just to summarize a bit. I mean, just to put in the frame, is that when we talk about legislations, though, we have to look at the parliamentarians, the member of parliament, basically decision makers that is actually enacting the laws with regards to the legislation for plants or what species to include. Now, bear in mind that I don't know how they think, but the way I've looked at how they look at things, they would actually juggle many different factors. Right? The first thing is economic, because that's highest priority, right? Livelihoods, jobs. Conservation comes somewhere in the mix, but then there could be other like social, cultural, and various other issues, including labor and so on that was brought up. But in most cases, when it comes to plants, though, because if you're not a timber product, the value is actually quite low. So from the economic point of view, timber obviously will be very high up on the agenda for them to enact legislations, or actually first and foremost, enact the policies that allow for the country to actually exploit the timber resources from the forest. Then they use the legislations basically to make sure they can do that in the way that would hopefully protect the forest sustainably, but allow them to continue. But for the other plants, if the economic valuation, the power relationship between all these different factors is low down on the totem pole, basically, then they are not going to look at legislations from the point of view of protection. So, but if there's a disease problem, pests, that then goes up, way up the scale. We need to protect those species because of legislation, pests that devastates our ecosystems and so on, our economic benefits, livelihood and so on. So we have to look at those relationships as well to be able to figure out what are the key barriers, why, and each country will be different a bit. So that is just to look at it, I think, in the way that from their perspective, in terms of the relationship that we need to look at for the legislation and policy decisions that they make. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for reminding us. I think that there's contextual sort of understanding how context of each country and kind of bringing concepts to wildlife trade, wildlife management, trade legislation just vary wildly. So great. Okay.
Yeah, just Chen made me think of something else that did come up in the group, which is one reason that animal species get listed maybe more commonly than plant species is because of interest groups. That maybe so also the same interest groups who are influencing those parliamentarians you talk about, Chen. And so those could be interest groups who are pushing for animal rights or animal welfare, or just have a general reaction against, increasing protection levels for a species that they find charismatic or that they're engaged with. And that just seems to be less of a dynamic in the plant trade world. But my generalization is specialists are more likely to say, well, actually, listing in CITES or some regulation is probably going to be worse for my species than it is going to benefit it. I don't know why that difference is. Maybe try and examine that. But I think that interest groups that drive legislative process or CITES process are also quite different in terms of the plant world than is often the case for some animal species, and certainly this is not true for a lot of insects or some reptiles or other species, but certainly true for others.
Thank you. No, that's a good point. My little story about this is that I'm a very late comer in traffic into CITES. I've spent most of my traffic career without knowing much about what CITES was, and then I did. And I got straight involved in analysis project of listing proposal for plants, which I poured a lot of energy in. And when it was going to the COP, I didn't go to COP, but the proposal obviously was. I've been warned that it could happen that there isn't much discussion about this species, and it was very controversial. There has been so many, different reactions from industry and also from conservation side about the listing of the proposal. But there wasn't even a minute of discussion actually. It literally just went through and was listed. Traffic's recommendation was not to list it for a whole number of reasons, including kind of actual evidence of threat from trade, but also the impact that the listing might potentially have on the sustainability of species. So interesting, just interesting point that I think, let's keep these ideas. We have a few minutes after we end this group's discussion for reflection and maybe next steps. Is there something here around communication or some sort of intelligent communication and becoming a pressure group that kind of stands and supports the plant issues in this arena? Tanya, have your hand up? Go for it.
So just to add on to what Steve was saying, I think those are very good points. The interest groups are very important. But bear in mind though that at least from the timber side, the industry interest group is a much more powerful lobby basically. And that is why they actually tone down a lot of legislation processes and so on, so that they can get away with a lot more things. So the other side of the interest groups also have to be looked at. And so if there are certain groups that are pushing for certain agendas, and they might have actually the ears of certain member of parliament or champions in the government and so on. So those are things that we need to look out for as well, especially when there's a lot of money involved.
Carly,
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to share an example, and this is both from a South African example and in the UK. I've experienced both. When sitting as a CITES scientific authority and engaging with stakeholders, so NGOs and industry, when it comes to listing proposals, they're quite vocal on not listing something because their trade is going to be impacted. Many of the NGOs are more vocal on the uplisting and the species survival. So there's always sort of a difference between the two. But when it's a non-COP year or something's not being listed like this year, so no one comes to the meetings. We have them regularly. South Africa, we had them quarterly. In the UK, it's quarterly. And no one pitches up to talk about research or investigating sustainable trade or getting the evidence. But in a COP year like it is now, everyone's at the table and they're all protecting their interests, as Chen said. So it's really quite hard. And I think we need to encourage, like you've said, Nastya, the academia and the conservation to actually have a voice, but a voice in the 3-year interim, in the periods between COPs, so that parties feel supported and heard, rather than just shouting at the last minute to try and get your way pushed through at a COP.
Thanks, Claude. Really, really good point. And because it's relevant to sort of this group discussion on something on barriers with regulation and implementation of those. Carly, there was something in your presentation where you were talking about that I took quite, and I think it's an interesting observation. You were saying the fact that Q has this great connection and relationship with other enforcement agencies actually really helps. And I'm sort of, because of who is kind of present also in the room and in the audience, I think it's such a powerful mechanism actually. How do we get institutions specifically interested in technical issues be working closely or putting themselves in the position of being working closer to provide those capacity and ID materials and so on to enforcement agencies? Very powerful. So I'm gonna go to group 4, which is answering question, what other mechanisms besides the law can be used to protect and ensure sustainable use of plants? And I think it's a nice one that would also give us a bit of springboard just to think about other approaches. And this big and polypathic.
Yes. So in our group, we had Coleman, Andre, Mohammed, and David. And I'm going to pass to Coleman, who volunteered to report back on our discussions.
Yes, indeed. Hi, everyone. And I will ask David and Andrea in particular to fill in on some things that I may have missed. There was quite a bit of overlap. It's interesting to see the way the same issues come up. I think it was group 2 was talking about sort of consumer demand and so on. And we talk a lot about demand reduction in relation to the trade in highly endangered animals, but really the key term is changing consumer behavior. And we were contrasting the fact that, many forestry enterprises, retailers of timber products, hardware shops selling doweling and paneling and timber planks and so on, and food shops selling fish, feel forced to go down a certification route because that's what consumers want. And we still have to, we're getting there with Fair Wild, but there's still a route to travel here. And, we do need to say, in order to publicize the value of certification to the consumer, because if the consumers demand it, then, the producers and the retail industry will follow. That Fair Wild is about certifying, equity of production as well. And in some of the earlier presentations, we talked about the social risks of the harvests of some of these plants. And I think it's harder. It might be harder to motivate consumers over the conservation importance of non-timber products, but they would be motivated if they know that there's a certification system that they can trust, that people aren't being exploited for the sake of the products that they're buying. In relation to that, voluntary action by the industry, David brought up about national biodiversity management plans and voluntary compliance by the industry in South Africa. And I don't know, David, whether you want to say anything more about that, because that was before we'd actually sort of worked out what we were going to, who was going to report back.
Coleman, yes, thanks. Yes, so we raised this around the biodiversity management plans, which, although published in government gazettes, it's a voluntary plan, which is implemented by various interest groups, including industry, NGOs, harvesters. Theoretically, it should involve everybody that's responsible for managing the industry or managing the resource. And if it works as well as it's meant to, then you get everybody working together to do that. But other similar forms of that in the communities of practice, I think, also have a similar function there, where you have industry groups or communities that will try and run that type of community-based conservation action, voluntary compliance, and that can lead to things like at festivals, you have a group of people that are interested in a particular plant resource. I think we were talking honeybush tea, where people come together and try and manage that resource together through festivals and other places where they can advertise the benefits of it and the conservation. Anyway, back to you, Colin.
Okay, thanks. So the next thing we discussed was the issue of gathering of wild plants for food and flavoring. And in Lebanon, with the influx of Syrian refugees, this has become a problem, but it's actually been effectively treated as an opportunity because the terraces that were used in the traditional agricultural practices in Lebanon, and some of these that are located within protected areas, are being used now to cultivate some of the plants in an internationally funded measure to make them available with the with cooperation of village communities and refugees, so that they're they go there for their herbs and so on, rather than just picking them in the wild where they might deplete the wild resource. And then we had quite a discussion, and this is where we really overlap the most with some of the other groups on the flexibility of CITES, because we had Andrea in our group who is involved in the propagation and trade of succulent species. And it comes back to the point that Carly and others made in their presentations earlier about CITES needs to be basically more adaptable, it's in the situation now where it's basically a burden on producers that are clearly not representing a conservation risk. It's mainly just because of the administrative inertia and so on. There has been some efforts in that, as we all know, around the use of phytosanitary certificates, around other fast tracking methods, but it's still very slow. And when we look at the trade in succulents, and because they're much easier to transport than other species, as live plants, you face particular enforcement difficulties and particular risks to endemic species. So I think those are the main things. I don't know whether any of my group members want to add anything to that.
I think that was a great summary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Super. Thank you so much. Very collaborative report back as well, and lots of ideas. It's a pretty wide open question, sort of, that takes us beyond what is the role, or how can regulations be improved for plants to improve sustainability. Does anybody else have any other thoughts? So I'll just repeat the question. The question was, what other mechanisms besides the law can be used to protect and ensure sustainable use of plants? I don't know if anybody has any responses, reactions to what was just mentioned, or otherwise. Jan, go for it.
Thanks. I think I wasn't sure whether Coleman actually summarized, but a couple of more points I think that might be useful, if not. One is that mechanism for code of conduct, code of practices, and so on by companies, so that we can build it in at their company level, basically, how they actually look at legality, but sustainability and so on, either at the company level and or probably better at the association level, so that all the members basically should be followed through, and then you can actually evaluate at the association level to the membership. That would be much stronger, I think. The other one is public procurement. You mentioned it at the start of the workshop conference, but I think you bear in mind that at the end of the day, public procurement actually is a very big market and demand driver. If governments themselves at all levels, central, provincial, local, cannot get its act well together, basically, and cannot leverage their purchasing power for legal and sustainable, then I think something is wrong with the government, in the sense that they don't have their priorities right. Just an additional point to say that one of the challenges for certification labeling processes that we are following, or we are using, a lot of consumer markets are using, is because of the failure or the lack of confidence of everyone with regards to the legal verification processes by government departments themselves. If you don't trust and believe that the things that they see, the permits that are being issued, is valid and has been verified and there's no corruption and so on that's happening, basically, which is a big ask, obviously. That is why all these alternative mechanisms are coming into being. Now, that means we are actually putting resources away from some of the central issues we are grappling with, and maybe we need to be judicious also and make sure that the governments themselves can do their job better, provided they are willing to be open, transparent, share information, collect the right set of information that we can all access, analyze, look at it, and shine the spotlight basically on the laws themselves and how they're implementing it for the sake of the plants that we're looking at in general. Because they look at all the plants, not just some of the plants at a country level. Thanks.
Right. Excellent. Any other comments? Anything else we could be doing to encouraging Caitlin?
Yeah, I was just thinking about when this group was talking about the importance of consumer demand for growing certifications, and kind of thinking about what actually is consumer demand and like how does it then result in this change of like businesses moving towards and adopting certifications. And I know I've talked about this a lot, but I have examples from the seafood sector, and I know like in that case what actually influenced businesses to move certain parts of their supply chains towards certification was this reputational fear, because Greenpeace was putting out these sustainability rankings and they didn't want to see themselves like basically slandered in the press or come at the bottom of this ranking. And then, yeah, just thinking about like the actual ways that what consumers want get represented and how that actually results in change. Maybe there weren't even that many consumers at home thinking, oh, I really want certified seafood, but it's actually through these like marketing aspects and public action by certain groups that these types of issues come into specific changes in business supply chains, things like Extinction Rebellion and stuff like that. So yeah, it's almost like thinking about reaching or like representing this consumer demand. It's like a marketing problem almost that would help us reach businesses more.
I think building on that also, there's a really critical role of retailers. So it's not true for all of these sectors, and it's going to be relevant in certain types of markets. But I think that's what's been quite powerful is the retailers being convinced that they have to predict where the market's going to go, and that they start taking that move. And they're the ones who are more vulnerable to the pressure groups who are pushing on them, rather than the consumers, I think, a lot of the time. And so, again, it doesn't work for everything, but for some of the ingredients we talked about today that are, they're quite hidden in the business at the moment, that's where the point of vulnerability is. So, yeah, I think that's something to add there. And certainly, companies often say, "Oh, well, we'll take action when our consumers care," but at the same time, do everything they can to make sure the consumers don't see what is in the ingredients. I think that's also what's got to change. Some sort of, this just basically pushing for transparency about what are in goods, and also pushing for consumer interest in that. But I mean, I think consumers on their own, it's a slow process of change. You need to get that representation. I know you're trying with the project you're working on, like consumer groups and consumer rights groups, to start putting the pressure from there, rather than thinking a sort of mass market movement to make a difference.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to speak on those two things we just discussed in the meeting room. But a lot of the reason why people know that animals are threatened is because they're taught it in school. And they go around the zoo and they see that animals are threatened. So there is a need within the botanical community, and it's a big thing that BGCI and I'm sure Kew Gardens do, which is to identify threatened species in their plant collections, because I'm sure if you talk to any of your friends about plants, they just assume that none of them are threatened because plants are everywhere. Like, we're seeing the green and we're assuming the green is fine, and that's just not the case. So that goes beyond even identifying species that are threatened in trade and the next steps you take towards it. But then I would also say about brands that are using plant products, they often market themselves as being like the green choice. But when you question it more deeply, like as a plant conservationist, and I'm sure if I went to talk to any of the staff in Body Shop or in Lush and asked them, but this is a threatened species, and they wouldn't know that. So I don't know if there's a lot of like communication and outreach aspects I think that could probably help towards more ecological consumption and sustainable consumption of goods. But yeah, I agree. It should, like, a consumer level is quite a slow level to work at, and I'm definitely for pushing larger organizations to kind of clean up their mess, I guess.
That's good. I'm all for it too. I think you raised two maybe they're related points, but there was also something in Carly's presentation, I think, about the education, and I was Carly said that number of programs generally teaching plant conservation have reduced because there is that lack of interest, and it's very sad and very interesting observation how that also links to what you were talking about, the kids that go to botanic gardens with their children, with their parents, when they're kids, what do they learn, and how that picks their interest in nature world and all aspects of it. It's a really interesting kind of aspect, I think, there of education. Chan?
Okay, for Kali. It's actually to add on to what Kali pointed out earlier with regards to the plant blindness. I think we might have to go back to a more fundamental look at how people look at plants, because in general, it's not about the plants per se. If you're talking about, let's say, forests, the plants that comes from the forest, basically, a lot of cultures, a lot of people look at not the plants itself, because to them, even if I live along the fringe of the forest, basically, it is a use, a resource. It's not because it's there, it gives me clean water and so on. It might affect me in that sense, but not. What they're looking at, and politicians and everyone else is looking at, is the land where the trees are being grown on. Now, and that is why governments take over the land, because then they can redistribute it the way they want to the political supporters and others. What happens is then the middlemen, everyone now flip the land basically for investments and so on, and everyone makes the money in a sense. Those are not belonging to the political elite, right? But what happens is that they are looking at it from the land perspective, and only certain groups that then look at the trees and the plants that are on the land. So by then, it's a bit too late, because they already classified the land, the whole country basically, into protected areas, no touch, production, conversion for industrial, dam building, whatever else you can think of, agriculture conversion. Then that's where all the flipping comes in. So the plants then gets viewed separately, totally separately, and by only select groups and small interest groups, and those who actually don't want to look at plants. So I think we need to flip our thinking as well and say, hey, that's what we're facing with in every country, especially in the poor South, because the land to the government is a free resource that they can distribute and disseminate to the largest. And how we want to fight against that, I think, is going to be fundamental as well. If not, we'll be just fighting fire with fire, basically, trying to just claw back a little bit. And that's what we are actually doing in many ways. Sorry to be a bit more pessimistic at the end of the day.
That's right. We'll take it all. We'll take pessimism and optimism. Carly, go for it. Optimism.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I know Kirstenbosch Botanic Garden, when I was there, we established the Garden of Extinction. And there was quite a bit of criticism and negativity, and we planted in it plants that were extinct in the wild, but luckily were safe in botanic gardens and still in existence. And the school groups used to go through there. Teachers would just bring them by themselves, and then we had our education program in the garden as well. And on my last slide, there was actually a picture of a tombstone that we had carved out of a big rock of polished granite, and it said Erica pyramidalis. Now that's extinct in the wild, it's gone, and all other extinct in the wild. And that drew so much attention and brought home to people that plants can go extinct and disappear. and that all the ones that they were seeing in this section of the garden weren't out there in the wild. And I think we're beyond being nice in some of our messaging. We almost have to start hitting hard and saying, these are gone, and unfortunately, I don't want to have graphic images of, I don't know, plants being strung up or something. I mean, that's just weird. But we can, there's ways to do it. We can be creative. And another awareness raising, which I do apologize, I missed some of the feedback from the groups, but we need to start looking at the influencers. We need to start looking at those people on social media who are holding up a pot plant or using a new cream or something that's got an orchid in it, and just, just not hammer them, but say, well, can you be an advocate for, you're promoting organic, you're promoting going green. Do you know that this species is listed on CITES? We're protecting endangered species, and getting them, and not us messaging it, but getting our message through those people who are already got followers. I'm not a social media addict or person or guru, but this is the way we need to get to the youngsters, through the schools, but through social as well.
Yeah, I think I'm going back to Megan's point and Carly's point about being creative. I think it's not just about overcoming plant blindness. People don't really understand ingredients. They're very complicated. You pick up things, and even if you want to do the right thing, you don't you don't know what half the things, because they might just have a chemical formula or something. So you can't. It's really difficult to make that connection. And I think what I've really seen on the cosmetic side and all the beauty products is the buzzword is vegan. I don't really know what that means, vegan. I mean, everybody's using it. What does it mean? And we've got to look at this kind of messaging and tease it apart a bit and say, how can we use what they're using, make it better informed? And I think around that as well, because I see vegan on so many products, which is kind of like, it's almost like equivalent to cruelty-free. I think that's how it's, how the story is being played out for encouraging people to buy it. But also I think this idea of being creative, you've got to have, the difference with the animal products is that emotional connection with animals that you don't really get with plants, or people don't feel it the same way with plants. But so we have to build the stories around maybe making those emotional connections through plants to animals or plants to people. We talked about the social aspect. So I think, to Carly's point about being creative, we've got to look at creating stories where we know people can make those connections. And we're not going to do that through just doing it through plants. I don't think so. I'm not trying to be negative, but I just think it would be difficult.
No, but it's very constructive, I think. Anybody objects? I think it's interesting. There were these two lines of school a bit, because I think we kept talking today about plants having value in their own right to be that there, as an subject of care and concern and regulation. But of course, I don't know about others in the room or online, but I've certainly used those connections to explain just how important the conservation of this plant is, because it is related to maybe Amazon ecosystem, or maybe it relates to a particular charismatic animal species, and that connection is much faster. But help us be great garden.
Just to follow on from that previous comment about cruelty-free, can I share my screen? Because I want to show you something that was seized at Heathrow 2 weeks back. It's not cruel. It's not gross. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. So this was a handbag that they seized because it had an elephant stitched on the front, and they looked, and it's cactus leather. So it's a vegan handbag. And if you read the middle paragraph, it says every product has been handcrafted using vegan leather made from cactus. Very proud. It's in bold, which is eco-friendly and cruelty-free. So it's great. But it's cactus and they had no permit for it, and it's CITES listed, and it just went down the wrong road. But it's a very positive, so we're actually engaging with these people to tell them that you need a CITES permit for it. Yes, it's cruelty free, but be aware. And this is the kind of messaging we need to get across. And I think that's where the problem is coming in, where, you know, you've got these messages, it's vegan and it's great, but there's a plant aspect to it, and there's also demand on those plants now. But yeah, vegan leather, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
Yeah, the impacts of that, yeah. Megan, go through it.
My question, or maybe comment, is completely away from what we've just been speaking about. Is that okay?
I'll go.
So I've been writing this red list of timber reports and also thinking about other conservation needs for timbers, and a lot of things that came out in the red list assessments for timbers is that there's very limited persecution of illegal crime syndicates about like who are poaching timber. And I was just wondering if anyone in the room had any comments on how we deal with that sort of stuff. I guess it goes back to what Carly was saying about the linkages between the illegal wildlife trade and the drug and narcotic trade and that sort of stuff. But I'm just kind of interested because we haven't really spoken about that aspect of trade, illegal wildlife trade yet. So I don't know if anyone has a comment.
I wonder if, well, I would just say that I think timber trafficking is one where there's probably the most evidence that organized crime is involved. But then I would also make the argument that corporate crime is also really critical to the perpetration of timber trafficking. So there are documented cases in both instances. Interpol's done a fair amount of work on this, and they've made open access some of the cases they've done, particularly out of Peru, where you have organized crime and corporate crime actually committing timber trafficking. Some of that is overlapped with drugs, but that's an area where, again, you need more data, because the way we record wildlife crime, we don't record wildlife crime, so we don't know it's happening in conjunction with all of these other black markets that we know about. But yeah, we could talk more about that, Megan. And I could send you some resources.
And I think, I wonder if David is still on the call with Chairman, so there is quite a lot of like vibrance of the space of work being on understanding the judicial sector and how the kind of prosecutions for crimes related to wildlife trafficking are prosecuted and what levels of punishment are included. And I think it's sort of maybe a little bit, I'm sure it's dependent on the country, but maybe it's a little bit like we talk about enforcement, and if there is no capacity and understanding, or if those crimes are treated differently from other crimes.
I was going to say, to some extent, this is an area where maybe plant blindness isn't the issue. There's generally, following through to organised crime groups from wildlife trade is a problem across all areas of wildlife trade, not just for plants. In fact, quite a lot of the enforcement response is driven by perceptions of harm in terms of economic value. In fact, you saw that from the UNODC slide earlier. That's actually a valuation estimate rather than a conservation harm estimate, and or even a quantity estimate. And that's how it's often perceived. So actually a big high-value timber shipment is probably more likely to impress a court in terms of prosecution if you do get an organised crime group there than some other species where conservation harm might be bigger. So that's one aspect. It's probably not that much different. On the other hand, there is an element of this which is sort of reflexive in terms of enforcement effort. And I was just doing a study about China's enforcement response on wildlife trade, and it's clear that a lot of the enforcement effort reflects what is seen as being the pressure to do something about wildlife trade. And that, a lot of that policy pressure has been very focused on a few charismatic species. So lo and behold, that's where customs put their resources. they respond to that because that's where a lot of the international questions have been coming from. So there is an issue there, but again, that's more to do with the belief that most illegal wildlife trade involves about 5 species, which seems to be a lot of the policy beliefs that's been driven. And the others are not just plants. There's lots of other species beyond that. And but I do think there is a general follow-up for illegal wildlife trade, a general problem with the follow-through and the coordination through to instigators of trade. But I mean, let's not forget that organised crime can mean lots of different things. It's not always about mafia groups. In fact, I'm really interested in the whole live plant trade, where actually it's much, the organisation is about networks of I could call enthusiasts or collectors, and those are organised networks where individual profit is probably not the driver. It's getting hold of what you want and making the network help you do that, and you help them to get what they want. But it also has a big conservation impact as well, but it's never going to be looked at in the same way in terms of crime, or it isn't at the moment, as what's perceived as a mafia group and maybe actually trading something else. A lot more to do in that area.
Thank you. Megan, I think you got at least maybe follow up with Steve and Tanya, because they seem to know quite a lot about this. I was really worried that we're going to finish early, and I sort of I don't worry anymore. So I was wondering if I can see people are dropping off as well. If I can say something little to kind of wrap up, and then give it off to Tanya to explain also what are some next steps. So one thing, I mean, this was so interesting, and great presentations, and also great discussion. I think if anything, there was Jared will remember a session of this that he put together for IUCN Congress that partly was that as well, on plant blindness, and I think one of the most memorable things that stayed with me is how it just seems that with plants we can be so creative because people just don't care enough. And so it's in a slightly joking way, but I wonder a little bit, how much, and actually this came up today a bit, what if we actually experimented more in this space? What if we understood better how bans work or restrictions in trade work, because maybe we have more leeway in terms of the attention, and we could be more exploratory about sustainability and legality of trade. But also what we talked about today is the urgency. I hope it came across as it was intended. It's a situation where we can't be complacent. We need the attention now on all sort of species and trade. So what to do about it in a kind of more collective action opportunity. So one thing I wanted to mention. So through the combination of IUCN, SSC, Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, as well as the Plant Conservation Committee, we're putting together this special group that's going to be focusing on plant use issues. It's called PUG, and I hope that really, really excites you, as it does me. And the group will be nestled within SULI, so within Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, and we're going to try and just have a bit more kind of concerted conversations and effort to focus on a few priorities around plants use and trade. So my hope is that some of the conclusions of this discussion today we can take into the PUG, into the discussion. So if I know a lot of you actually probably, especially online, are on this call because you already said you're interested to be in PUG. But if anybody else who is not, never heard about this yet, if that's something you're interested in, please get in touch with Katya, Rachel, or me, and hopefully we can take it forward. I think in a trade space, it's a big year with CITES conference and parties coming up. So other particular things we could be doing there. We talked today a lot about interest groups and bringing communication and messaging about plants trade. Maybe there is some sort of is there some sort of plan? Is there some sort of communication materials? Can we get those influencers to talk about this? So for me, thank you very much. This was really stimulating and such a luxury to to see some people in person, and thanks so much for everybody else being online. Thank you to everyone for spending so much of your busy schedules with us. I think it was a really interesting, useful conversation. So for us, there's a Zoom recording that we'll get to people or post probably, I'm not sure if Traffic has its own space, but my group of network has a YouTube channel that we can post it on. There's also going to be shorter clips and documentaries produced at this event today, but the other workshops that this project has held. So watch that space. Also be producing a bit of an executive summary. So if anyone wants to send me thoughts or notes, I'll be writing up probably no more than 2 pages to share a summary of the thoughts, and maybe we could get that to Hug. And then also I don't think it's a conflict of interest. I'm going to give a shout out though to the Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. I think that there is so much scope for people in the room to collaborate on projects about plants. As Carly mentioned, that there's a real shortage of projects about plants, so it'd be great for people to consider that. There is another round coming later this year, so do start talking and collaborating. And I think too, there's the latest round that we just sat in on. So Stephen, Carly, and I, there's an evidence-based project which is just about gathering good practice, gathering data about what needs to be done and what projects could work. And those are smaller projects, but plants might be really ideal to that kind of bid or project. So I'd encourage you all to collaborate on that as well. And yeah, just hopefully it's a good network to keep in touch. And thanks again, everyone, for coming. One organizational matter, because we didn't ask, but and I didn't ask everyone that people were here, but we could follow up just with answering to an email to everyone so that you have each other's email addresses. Does anybody object to that? Hopefully not. Right, okay, thank you. Then you can get in touch with each other as well. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for everybody, in particular. Just a shout out to everybody who stayed really up late. Chen, I'm looking at you, and a few other people. Chen is based in Malaysia, so I don't know, what time is it? 1, 2?
Yes.
Probably good. 1? No, not 1. Okay. But thank you so much, and have a good day.
Everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Stuff in here.